The quiet hum of the truck stop filled the air, a steady rhythm that had become familiar to Jack Grizzly Turner. The only light in the small diner came from the neon sign flickering outside, casting a dim glow across the cracked leather seats and worn formica countertops. It was the kind of place where time slowed down. The truckers who stopped in here were regulars, and they all knew one another by name. They weren't in a rush. Life on the road was simple, and for Jack, that was all he wanted. He sipped his coffee slowly, his worn hands wrapped around the chipped mug, eyes scanning the dull flickering of the TV in the corner. There was something peaceful about being far from the chaos of the world. His military days felt like a distant memory, a chapter of his life that seemed to belong to someone else. The nightmares had faded to a dull murmur in the back of his mind, something he could shove away most days. But tonight, something was different. The soft jingle of the bell over the diner door rang out, sharp against the calm, and Jack looked up. A group of bikers had entered, swaggering into the diner like they owned the place. Their leather jackets and patched vests clattered as they moved, laughter and raucous talk filling the air as they took up the corner booth. The clink of bottles and the low hum of conversation created a new tension in the room. Jack didn't pay them much attention at first. He'd seen plenty of groups like this over the years, loud, brash, and always looking to make trouble. But then something about this group felt different. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a dark beard and a scar running down his cheek, caught Jack's eye. His name, as Jack would learn later, was Kyle, and the arrogance in his eyes was clear. The rest of the gang followed, taking up space, laughing too loud, and throwing insults at the quiet truckers who already occupied the diner. Jack remained in his seat, unfazed. He had dealt with worse in his life, much worse. But tonight was going to be different. Kyle eyed Jack, his gaze sharp and calculating. There was something about the old man sitting alone in the corner that intrigued him. His weathered face, covered in a scruff of gray stubble, his posture, so rigid and calm. It didn't add up. The other bikers were too busy enjoying their drinks, but Kyle couldn't resist. He stood up, his boots thumping on the floor as he made his way over to Jack's table. The quiet hum of conversation seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the sound of Kyle's footsteps echoing in the diner. Jack looked up at him, his eyes steady. "You got a problem?" he asked, his voice low, but not unfriendly. Kyle smiled, a cruel smirk curling at the corners of his lips. "You look like you've seen some things, old man. You a veteran or something? Or just another relic stuck in time?" Jack's fingers tightened around the mug. He'd heard this before. He had been called worse, and much more cruelly, in his lifetime. The mocking tone didn't faze him, but something about the way Kyle stood there, trying to provoke him, felt like a test. The room grew silent. Jack could feel the weight of the gang's eyes on him, the other truckers at the counter exchanging uneasy glances. They knew who Jack was, Grizzly, the old veteran who rarely got involved in anything. He'd been in too many fights in his life, and now, all he wanted was a cup of coffee and some peace. But peace, Jack had learned long ago, wasn't always a choice. Kyle leaned in closer, his breath thick with alcohol. "You think you're tough, huh? You think you can scare me? You just an old man trying to get by." Jack's hand tightened around the cup, but he didn't rise from his seat. He had learned over the years that reacting too quickly could be a mistake. But this wasn't just a regular nuisance. There was something in Kyle's eyes that Jack didn't trust. Kyle wasn't finished. He pulled up a chair and sat down across from Jack, close enough that Jack could smell the leather and cheap cologne wafting from his clothes. The rest of the gang continued to watch, waiting for something to happen. Jack didn't say a word. He just stared back at Kyle, calm and unyielding. "You gonna ignore me, old man?" Kyle taunted, his grin growing wider. He slapped Jack's coffee cup, causing the liquid to spill over the sides. "Looks like you're too scared to do anything. All bark and no bite." The bikers around the diner laughed, their raucous cackles cutting through the tension like a knife. Jack wiped the spilled coffee from the counter with a napkin. He didn't speak, but his mind raced. He wasn't a man who liked to fight anymore. His hands had seen enough bloodshed in their day. But tonight, in this place, with these people, he could feel the pressure building. He wasn't just some washed-up veteran. He had a past, a purpose. And Kyle had no idea what he was dealing with. Jack's fingers flexed. His calm exterior was the calm before a storm. The biker's words had struck a nerve, and Jack was about to show Kyle and his gang that they had messed with the wrong man. The tension in the diner reached a boiling point as Kyle's fingers wrapped around the chain at his waist. The metallic clink echoed in the silence, and the other bikers leaned forward, eager for the fight that seemed inevitable now. Jack stood, calm and steady, his eyes never leaving Kyle's. His fingers twitched slightly, the only sign of the storm building within him. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down, like the world was holding its breath. The flickering neon light outside cast strange shadows across the diner, illuminating faces tense with anticipation. Even the truckers at the counter had stopped eating, eyes locked on the confrontation. Kyle's smirk was gone, replaced by something darker. "You think you can handle this, old man?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. He flicked the chain in his hand, sending a warning signal. Jack didn't respond immediately. He was waiting, gauging. He had been in situations like this before, in places far worse than a truck stop diner. And in those moments, instinct took over. He didn't need to draw his weapon, didn't need to shout or make a scene. He knew the quickest way to end this was to make sure Kyle understood exactly who he was dealing with. Without warning, Kyle swung the chain at Jack's head, the metal snapping through the air with lightning speed. It was a classic move, one Jack had seen countless times before. But instead of dodging or retreating, Jack moved with surprising swiftness for a man of his age. He grabbed Kyle's wrist mid-swing, his grip ironclad. Kyle's eyes widened in shock, his chain now useless in Jack's grip. For a split second, he felt the raw power of Jack's hold, a force that felt almost unnatural. Then, in one smooth motion, Jack twisted Kyle's arm, forcing the biker to drop the chain with a sharp cry of pain. The room went silent again, the fight now tangible in the air. Kyle's gang seemed momentarily stunned, unsure of how to react to the turn of events. But Jack wasn't done. With his free hand, Jack gripped the collar of Kyle's leather vest and yanked him forward, slamming him into the edge of the table. The other bikers jumped to their feet, but none of them moved quickly enough to stop what was happening. Jack didn't give them a chance. "You talk too much," Jack growled, his voice low and steady. "I don't have time for this crap." He shoved Kyle back, sending him stumbling toward the booth. Kyle, his pride wounded and his temper flaring, lunged at Jack again, but this time he was slower. Jack saw it coming, a predictable, desperate move from a man who had underestimated him. Before Kyle could land a blow, Jack caught his arm and, in one fluid motion, flipped him onto the floor. A sickening thud echoed through the diner as Kyle crashed onto the concrete with a grunt of pain. He lay there, dazed, gasping for air. For a moment, there was a hush, as though everyone in the diner was holding their breath, unsure of what would happen next. Kyle's gang stood frozen, watching their leader in shock. Some looked to Jack, their faces a mixture of disbelief and fear. Jack, however, didn't wait for them to make their move. He turned toward the rest of the bikers with a calm but dangerous expression. His voice, steady and commanding, cut through the air. "This is your last chance," he said. "If anyone else wants to try something, I'm right here." The bikers exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to continue their assault or back down. The gang's bravado was crumbling, and the realization slowly dawned on them. They had messed with the wrong guy. Kyle, still recovering from the fall, scrambled to his feet, a mix of rage and disbelief in his eyes. He wiped a trickle of blood from his lip, glaring at Jack. "You think you can humiliate me in front of my own crew?" His voice was raw, strained with anger. Jack didn't flinch. He met Kyle's glare head-on, unyielding. "You made the mistake of underestimating me." His words were measured, controlled, but carried the weight of experience. "Now, you can either walk out of here with your pride shattered, or you can leave with nothing." Kyle hesitated, eyes flicking between Jack and his crew. The bikers around him shifted, looking to their leader for guidance. But Kyle was starting to realize something. He had bitten off more than he could chew. Jack wasn't some soft target he could bully into submission. The old man had skill, experience, and the kind of grit that came from a lifetime of surviving hell. After what seemed like an eternity, Kyle's shoulders sagged. His anger was still there, but the fight was gone. He knew when to cut his losses. Without a word, he turned on his heel and stormed toward the door, his gang trailing behind him in silence. As the bikers filed out of the diner, Jack stood still, watching them go. The adrenaline still buzzed through his veins, but he wasn't about to let it take control. He had been through enough in his life to know that violence was never the solution. Unless, of course, there was no other option. And tonight, it had been the only option. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving the diner eerily quiet. The truckers at the counter let out collective sighs of relief, and the tension in the air slowly began to dissipate. Jack took a deep breath, finally relaxing as the adrenaline faded. He returned to his seat, his coffee now cold but untouched. The brief silence was broken only by the distant hum of a passing truck outside. The waitress, a young woman who had been watching from behind the counter, came over hesitantly. "You all right, sir?" she asked softly. Jack nodded, his gaze steady. "I'm fine." But even as he spoke, he knew something had changed. The bikers might have left, but they weren't gone for good. And Jack had a feeling that this wasn't the last time he'd see them. The quiet after the bikers left was a welcome relief, but for Jack, it was fleeting. He sat back in his booth, staring out the window as the night stretched on. The streetlights outside flickered, casting long shadows across the diner's floor. But the calm was deceptive. He knew something was coming. The waitress, still lingering nearby, seemed uncertain whether to approach or give Jack his space. Jack caught her eye and gave her a small, reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm fine," he said again, this time with more finality. "You don't need to worry about me." She hesitated for a moment longer, then nodded and went back to her station. But Jack could sense the curiosity behind her gaze, the kind of quiet observation that always came when someone saw something they didn't fully understand. It wasn't the first time he'd seen that look in his life, and he was sure it wouldn't be the last. Jack was no stranger to conflict, but the bikers had hit a nerve, something deeper than just a simple confrontation. There was something about Kyle's taunts, the way he challenged Jack so carelessly, that brought him back to another time, another place. The memories he tried to bury, the ones he wished he could forget, came rushing back, flooding his mind with images of the war. His mind flashed to the jungles of Vietnam, the smoke rising from the trees, the thunder of gunfire, the faces of comrades lost to violence. He had been a different man then, a younger man. Back then, he had been forged in the fires of combat. The war had taken so much from him, but it also gave him something, a strength, a resilience, an ability to survive when all seemed lost. But the war was over, and for years, Jack had been trying to leave that life behind. He'd built a life for himself after the army. He'd found peace in the quiet, in the solitude of the open road, and in moments like this, sitting at a truck stop diner, sipping his coffee and watching the world go by. The quiet was what he craved. But the bikers, they had a way of bringing out the old Jack, the one who fought to survive, who didn't back down from a challenge. Jack took another sip of his coffee, the bitter taste a grounding force, but it couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the bikers wouldn't be the last threat he'd face tonight. He had barely managed to avoid a confrontation with them, but he knew from experience that once you made an enemy, they didn't just disappear. The door to the diner opened, and Jack's senses sharpened. He didn't have to look up to know that someone had just walked in. There was something about the way the door swung open, the sound of boots scraping against the floor, the low murmur of voices that told him another storm was on the horizon. A man in his late 30s, wearing a weathered leather jacket and a baseball cap, approached the counter. He wasn't a biker, but Jack had seen his type before. Someone who was down on their luck, someone trying to hide from something. His face was a little too pale, and his eyes darted around the room as if he was looking for something, or someone. The man took a seat at the counter, ordering a coffee without looking at the waitress. Jack watched him from his booth, his instincts on high alert. It wasn't that he was suspicious of the guy. It was more like a feeling, an old gut reaction that had kept him alive more times than he cared to admit. The man looked harmless enough, but Jack knew better. The night was still young, and trouble had a funny way of finding him. The door opened again, this time with more force. The sound of it slamming against the wall was enough to make Jack's head snap up. 2 more men entered, both wearing similar jackets and carrying themselves with the same cocky swagger. They were much younger, probably in their 20s, and their eyes quickly scanned the diner. When they saw the man at the counter, the one Jack had been watching, their expressions darkened. Without a word, they slid into the booth across from the man. Jack's eyes narrowed. There was something about the way the 3 men interacted, something that wasn't quite right. They weren't strangers, but neither did they seem like friends. There was tension between them, a kind of unspoken animosity. Jack could hear their low voices from across the room. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but in a place like this, where every sound seemed to carry, it was impossible not to catch bits and pieces of their conversation. "Thought you disappeared, huh?" one of the younger men said, his tone menacing. "Thought you could just skip town and we wouldn't find you?" The man at the counter, the one Jack had been observing, flinched. His hand gripped his coffee cup tightly, his knuckles white. "I didn't," he began, but his voice faltered. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I had to get away." The younger man laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "You think we don't know what you did? Think we wouldn't come looking for you?" The older man shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward Jack's booth for a brief moment, but he quickly looked away, as if embarrassed. Jack leaned back in his seat, watching carefully. The conversation wasn't clear, but it was enough to give him a sense of unease. These weren't just any men. They were trouble. Maybe not bikers like the ones before, but they carried the same dangerous aura. Whatever they were talking about, Jack was sure it wasn't good. The man at the counter was in deep, and he didn't seem like the type who could get himself out of this mess. And then it hit Jack. The situation, the tension, the desperation in the air. It was all too familiar. It was like looking into a mirror of his past. The ghosts of his war days, the deals gone wrong, the enemies he had to face. Jack stood up slowly, his hand brushing against his jacket, the familiar weight of the old revolver at his side a comfort, even if he hadn't intended to use it. He didn't need to get involved, but if these guys were going to make a scene, he wasn't about to sit idly by. His eyes locked on the trio at the counter. He had a feeling this night was far from over. The diner felt like it was holding its breath, every sound amplified in the tense silence. Jack's boots scraped softly against the floor as he made his way to the counter, his every step deliberate. He didn't want to make a scene, but the feeling of unease crawling under his skin wouldn't let him ignore it. The 3 men at the booth hadn't noticed him approach, their conversation still low, but heated. Jack took a seat at the counter, a few stools down from the man who seemed to be at the center of this drama. He could hear bits of their conversation now, enough to understand that things were escalating quickly. "You can't just run from this, Ricky," one of the younger men said, his voice dripping with malice. "You think we'll let you get away with what you did?" Ricky, the man at the counter, gripped his coffee cup so tightly his knuckles were turning white. "I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt," he muttered, almost pleading. "I was just trying to survive, like you. You know how it is." The other man snorted. "Survive? You were stealing from us, Ricky. You don't get to just walk away from that. Not after what you did." Jack's eyes flicked from the men to the waitress, who was standing behind the counter, trying her best to stay out of the way. Her nerves were obvious, and she shot Jack a brief, desperate look. She could sense what was coming, just like he could. Jack leaned forward, his voice low and measured, but carrying the weight of someone who had seen far too much. "You're making a mistake," he said calmly, but with an edge that made both men glance up. "Whatever this is, whatever you think you're owed, it's not going to end the way you think it will." The 2 men turned to look at Jack, their eyes narrowing as they assessed him. The silence in the diner deepened, the air thick with tension. Ricky, his face pale and sweaty, seemed to shrink back, his fear obvious. "You got a problem, old man?" the younger man with the baseball cap said, his lip curling into a sneer. He didn't seem the least bit intimidated by Jack, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "This doesn't concern you." "I've got no problem," Jack replied smoothly, not taking his eyes off the man. "But it looks like it's about to concern me. And when things get ugly, I don't like to stand by." Ricky looked over at Jack with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "Please, don't get involved. This is between me and them." Jack didn't respond immediately. He just kept his gaze steady, assessing the situation. The younger man seemed eager to escalate things, but Jack knew how these kinds of situations played out. And Ricky, for all his guilt, wasn't the real problem. It was the other two men, the ones who didn't care about right or wrong, only power and control. The man in the leather jacket, who had been quieter until now, suddenly stood. His posture was more controlled, his eyes steely. "You don't know what you're talking about, old man," he said slowly. "You don't know the first thing about loyalty or betrayal. This is family business." Jack didn't flinch. "Family? That's what you call this?" He gestured toward Ricky, who was now visibly shaking. "This man's got debts, but it doesn't mean you can just intimidate him into submission. Not in here. Not tonight." The leather-jacketed man's eyes narrowed dangerously. He took a step toward Jack, but it was the way he moved that gave Jack pause. This wasn't the reckless swagger of the younger man. This was a man used to conflict, used to taking control, the kind of person who knew how to handle a situation with violence if necessary. "I don't think you understand," the man said, his voice low and threatening. "You're out of your depth here. You think you can play the hero, but this is real life, not some movie. You want to walk away, or we'll make sure you don't." Jack's hand brushed against the edge of his jacket, where his old revolver rested. He didn't draw it yet, but the gesture was a reminder. He wasn't afraid of a fight. He had been in more than his fair share, and if it came down to it, he wouldn't hesitate. Before the situation could escalate further, the door to the diner opened once again. The bell above it jingled, and all eyes turned as a tall figure stepped in, silhouetted against the dim light outside. The newcomer paused for a moment, scanning the room with a calm, calculated gaze that immediately set Jack on edge. The man's eyes locked with Jack's, and there was a quiet recognition in his expression, as if he knew exactly who Jack was. The newcomer was dressed in a dark coat, the collar turned up against the night chill. He was older, but his sharp features and the way he carried himself suggested experience and power. He glanced at Ricky and the two men at the booth, and his lips curled into a small, amused smile. "Am I interrupting something?" he asked smoothly, his voice steady and controlled. The two younger men seemed momentarily thrown off by the new arrival. The leather-jacketed man's posture stiffened, but his earlier bravado faltered for just a second. He looked at the newcomer like he wasn't quite sure whether he was a threat or an ally. Jack's instincts kicked into high gear. This man wasn't just another bystander. He was part of whatever game was unfolding here, and his presence could either tip the balance in favor of Jack or drag him into something far more dangerous. Ricky, who had been quiet up until now, seemed to recognize the man immediately. His face paled further, and he muttered under his breath, "Not him. Please, not him." The newcomer stepped further into the diner, his eyes scanning the room with careful precision. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. His very presence commanded attention. "I've been looking for you," he said to Ricky, his voice smooth but carrying an unmistakable edge. "And it seems like I've found you at last." Jack's fingers tightened around the edge of his mug. Something told him that whatever was about to happen would change everything. This wasn't just a simple confrontation anymore. The stakes had just been raised, and Jack was no longer just a witness. He was a player. The stranger's words hung in the air like a storm cloud on the horizon, heavy and threatening. Jack watched him closely, noting the calmness with which the man spoke. His voice was the kind that didn't need to raise itself to command authority. It simply existed, suffused with the weight of someone used to getting exactly what they wanted. The younger men at the booth shifted uncomfortably, casting glances between themselves and the newcomer. Ricky, on the other hand, seemed to shrink further into himself, his shoulders hunched as if he were trying to disappear. The room, once filled with the low hum of conversation and clinking silverware, was now stiflingly silent. The waitress, who had been quietly observing from behind the counter, took an instinctive step back, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped down the counter for the umpteenth time. She knew the kind of people who walked into places like this. She'd seen it before, the intimidation, the unspoken power struggles. Jack wasn't going to let this play out passively. He wasn't even sure why he was sticking his neck out for a man like Ricky. It wasn't out of any particular sense of justice. He'd fought too many battles to be naive about right and wrong. But there was something about the whole situation that rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was the way Ricky had pleaded for mercy, or maybe it was just that old reflex of not letting people get away with terrorizing others. The newcomer took another step closer to the booth, his eyes fixed on Ricky. "You thought you could run," he said, his voice almost sympathetic now, as if speaking to a wayward child. "Thought you could disappear into the night, and we wouldn't come for you. You should know better, Ricky. You're never far enough away." Ricky's voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't want any of this. You don't understand. I just wanted out. I didn't mean to cross you. I didn't." The stranger sighed, a sound that conveyed both annoyance and disappointment. He stepped around the booth, his gaze lingering on Jack for a brief moment, before he moved to stand directly in front of Ricky. "You think I care about your excuses?" he said coldly. "You were part of the family, Ricky. You don't get to leave the family without consequences. We all have our roles to play, and you broke yours." Jack's fingers brushed the edge of his mug again, but he made no move to stand. He wasn't about to draw attention to himself, not yet. His eyes narrowed as he watched the scene unfold, weighing his options. The stranger had an air of control about him, something that spoke to years of power plays, of manipulating situations to get what he wanted. This wasn't just about a debt, it was about dominance. The two younger men, still silent, were now eyeing the stranger with a mix of wariness and respect. The older man, the one in the leather jacket, gave a subtle nod to the newcomer. Jack could tell that the power dynamic had shifted in an instant. Ricky, who had once been the object of their anger, was now being held accountable by someone with even more authority. The stranger reached into his coat and pulled out a small folder, one that looked like it had seen better days. He opened it carefully, like someone who didn't want to disturb the fragile contents inside. Ricky's eyes followed the folder's movement, his anxiety palpable. "This is your last chance," the stranger said, his tone now taking on a chilling finality. "You can either make things right, or you can make them worse for yourself." Ricky swallowed hard, his face drenched in sweat. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't hurt anyone else." Before Ricky could finish, the stranger slammed the folder onto the table with enough force to make the cups rattle. "It's too late for that," he said, cutting Ricky off. "The moment you decided to steal from us, you sealed your fate. There's no way out now. You have two choices. You fix your mistake, or we fix it for you." The younger man with the baseball cap chuckled darkly. "Guess he picked the wrong time to run, huh?" Jack's eyes flicked to the men at the booth. They were clearly enjoying the power they had over Ricky, but the newcomer was a different kind of threat. The younger men didn't seem to realize it yet, but Jack did. This man was calm, collected, and far more dangerous than either of them. The quiet tension in the room was almost unbearable. Jack's mind raced as he considered what to do. He had already made his presence known, and he could see the stranger sizing him up, perhaps wondering if Jack was a threat or just another bystander. Jack wasn't one to back down from conflict, but this was different. There was a weight to this situation that felt like it could tip over into something far worse than a barroom brawl. The stranger's gaze finally shifted to Jack, locking eyes with him across the room. For a moment, Jack felt the full force of his attention. Sharp, calculating, and unyielding. "I'd advise you to stay out of this," the stranger said, his voice calm. But there was an undeniable threat beneath the surface. "This isn't your fight." Jack didn't flinch. "Looks like it's my fight now," he said coolly, his fingers still brushing the edge of his jacket where his revolver was tucked. The stranger didn't respond right away, but the slight narrowing of his eyes was enough. Jack could feel the shift in the room, the way all eyes were now on him, waiting for him to make a move. The younger men, still unaware of the real danger they were dealing with, looked from the stranger to Jack, their confusion turning into suspicion. They didn't know who Jack was or what he was capable of, but the stranger did. Jack could tell by the way the man's expression darkened, the subtle tension that gripped him for just a moment. Jack wasn't sure how this was going to play out, but one thing was clear. He had just stepped into something much bigger than he had anticipated. The stranger took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Jack's. "You've got guts," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I'll give you that. But guts won't save you from the consequences of your actions. Jack didn't respond. Instead, he kept his posture relaxed, his eyes scanning the room, waiting for the right moment to act. He wasn't here to start a war, but if this was going to turn violent, he wasn't about to back down. And judging by the look in the stranger's eyes, neither was he. The air in the diner felt thick, heavy with the potential for violence. Jack didn't move, didn't let his gaze waver from the stranger's eyes. Every second that ticked by felt like a countdown. The younger men in the booth were still caught in their confusion, unsure of what to make of the situation, but the stranger's focus was solely on Jack now. "I think you've misunderstood, old man," the stranger said, his voice colder than before. "This isn't about courage. This is about survival. And you're in the way." Jack could feel the tension building, the lines drawn between him and the man who stood across from him. He had seen this before. Two men sizing each other up, both trying to gauge how far the other would go. The difference here was that Jack wasn't afraid of consequences. He had faced worse in his life, and he wasn't going to back down now. "I'm not in the way," Jack replied evenly. His voice didn't shake, didn't betray the knot of adrenaline that had begun to form in his stomach. "You're in the wrong place. This is a truck stop, not your personal playground. And you're not going to make it yours, not if I have a say in it." The stranger's lips curled into a cold smile, but there was no humor in it. "You think you can stop me?" His eyes flicked to the two men sitting behind him, their faces hardening as they exchanged looks. Jack's own fingers flexed involuntarily, and for a split second, he thought about drawing his weapon. But something told him that wouldn't end the way he wanted. "Is this really how you want to do this?" Jack asked, his voice low but carrying a weight of experience. "You think pushing people around is going to get you respect? No one's afraid of men like you. You can hide behind power and intimidation, but eventually it catches up with you." The stranger's smile faded. The room grew even quieter, as if the diner itself was holding its breath, waiting for the first sign of violence. Ricky, still sitting at the counter, looked like he was about to faint. His hands were shaking uncontrollably, and his eyes darted between the stranger and Jack. "I don't know who you are, but you need to leave. Now." The stranger's words were sharp, his gaze unwavering. "You don't want to be part of this." Jack's face remained neutral, but inside, his instincts were on high alert. He could feel the pressure building in the room, the anticipation of something about to explode. The stranger wasn't just trying to intimidate him, he was testing him. And Jack knew that if he didn't respond correctly, things were going to get ugly. The waitress, who had been watching from a safe distance, was now standing behind the counter, wringing her hands nervously. Jack could tell she was scared, but also knew she was powerless in this situation. Still, she was waiting for someone to take control. "I'm not going anywhere," Jack said, his voice calm but resolute. "And I'm not going to let you bully that man any longer." The stranger's eyes flicked back to Ricky, who was still visibly trembling, trying to shrink into himself. "You think you're the one who gets to decide what happens to him?" the stranger said, his voice low and threatening. "I'm the one standing between you and him," Jack replied. "And that's enough for me." The man in the leather jacket, who had been silent up until now, stood up from the booth. His eyes narrowed as he walked over to join the stranger, standing just a few feet away from Jack. He was taller, broader, and his presence was more menacing. This was the muscle. Jack could see it in his posture, the way he carried himself with the confidence of someone who was used to being the enforcer. "You think you can take us both on, old man?" the leather-jacketed man sneered, cracking his knuckles in a show of intimidation. "Maybe you need a lesson in who's in charge here." Jack didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge the challenge, keeping his focus on the stranger. He knew how to handle men like this. His mind was already running through the scenarios, calculating the odds. The stranger was a threat, sure, but the muscle wasn't as much of a concern. Jack had dealt with men like him before. The tension was thick now. The whole diner felt like it was teetering on the edge of something dangerous. Jack could see the muscles in the two younger men's jaws tightening, could feel their eagerness to see what would happen next. But it was the stranger who had Jack's full attention. "I don't want to fight," Jack said, his voice steady. "But I'm not going to let you tear this place apart just because you think you can." So, here's what's going to happen. You walk out, and we all walk away. No one gets hurt. Or you make the wrong move, and you'll regret it. The stranger's eyes hardened, and for a moment, Jack saw something flicker in them. Was it recognition? A fleeting doubt? It was hard to tell, but in that moment, the man hesitated, just for an instant. Then the moment passed. You really think you can stop us? The stranger asked, his voice still smooth, but now laced with a hint of frustration. Jack nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the stranger's. I'm not alone here. The statement was subtle, but the message was clear. Jack wasn't afraid to make allies if he needed to. And even if he was alone, he wasn't going down without a fight. The newcomer seemed to weigh his options, his eyes flicking around the room. He could feel the heat of the other men's glares, the energy that had shifted with Jack's declaration. The two younger men were tense, waiting for a sign. They were pawns in this game, caught between the stranger and Jack, unsure of which side to choose. But the leather-jacketed man still didn't seem to get it. His posture remained threatening as he moved closer to Jack, his fists clenched. Jack stayed calm. You've got one chance to walk away. I don't want to hurt you, but I will if I have to. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Then, the stranger smiled, but it was a tight, dangerous smile. You've got guts, old man, he said, his tone no longer as mocking as before. But I'm not here to play nice, and I don't think you're ready for what happens next. Jack was ready. He had been ready for a long time. And just as the stranger took a step toward him, a sharp voice cut through the room. Enough. The voice that interrupted the standoff was unexpected, and it carried an authority that seemed to command the room. Everyone froze for a moment, turning their heads toward the source of the interruption. It was the waitress. She had stepped away from the counter, her usually calm demeanor replaced with something more fierce. Her hands were no longer trembling. They were steady, clenched into fists at her sides. Jack looked at her, surprised. He had assumed she was just another bystander, caught up in the drama of the moment. But now, standing in front of the counter, her expression was resolute, unwavering. You think this is your territory? She said, her voice steady and sharp. This is a truck stop, and it's been here long before you decided to show up. If you're going to cause trouble, you better take it somewhere else. The stranger, who had been preparing to make his move, narrowed his eyes at her. His hands didn't move from his sides, but the tension in his posture told Jack everything he needed to know. This was no ordinary waitress. For a moment, the silence in the diner seemed to stretch, as if the entire place was holding its breath. The younger men shifted uneasily in their seats, unsure of how to respond. Ricky, still trembling, was trying to keep his head down, though his eyes were darting nervously between the stranger, Jack, and the waitress. The stranger took a step back, his gaze flicking from Jack to the woman who had spoken up. You've got guts, he muttered, though his voice was tinged with disbelief. The waitress didn't flinch. I don't need guts. I just need you to leave. For the first time, there was uncertainty in the stranger's eyes. Jack could feel the shift in the air. The stranger had expected to intimidate everyone in the room. But now, faced with the unexpected challenge from the waitress, his confidence wavered. Jack seized the moment. His voice was low but firm, and he finally stood, his presence becoming even more noticeable. This woman's right. You've made your point. But you don't own this place, and you don't own us. You can either walk out of here or deal with us. Your choice. The stranger's eyes flicked between Jack and the waitress, clearly weighing his options. Jack knew that, for someone like the stranger, backing down wasn't easy, but neither was losing face in front of his men. The threat had been made clear, but it wasn't just Jack and the waitress that were now standing against him. It was the entire room. The waitress took another step toward him. You've made a mess of things already. I suggest you don't make it worse. The stranger seemed to consider that for a long moment. He was a man who had never been challenged in this way before. But something in Jack's unflinching stance, the waitress's no-nonsense attitude, and the way the room had united in this unspoken bond gave him pause. His men were restless, clearly waiting for a signal, but the stranger raised his hand, signaling for them to stand down. The tension that had filled the air for what seemed like an eternity began to ebb, though the unease still lingered like a storm cloud, ready to break. The stranger looked back at Ricky, his expression dark. "This isn't over," he said in a voice that carried no trace of the calm he had previously shown. "You're lucky, but we're coming for you. You can't run forever." Ricky swallowed, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't want any more trouble. I just want to disappear." The stranger gave him a cold, pitiless stare. "You should have thought of that before you crossed us." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the diner, his two younger men trailing behind him like shadows. The door slammed shut behind them, the bell ringing sharply in the stillness that followed. The moment they were gone, a collective breath seemed to be released from the room. People began to move again, but the uneasy tension was still there. Jack looked at the waitress, surprised but grateful. "You've got a backbone," he said, offering her a nod of respect. She shrugged, her expression softening just slightly. "I don't want trouble, but this is my place. And when people like that come in and start causing problems, I don't just stand by." Jack chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "I guess I underestimated you." "Thank you." The waitress gave him a small smile, but it quickly faded as her eyes flicked to Ricky, who was still seated at the counter, visibly shaken. "You sure you're okay?" she asked him. Ricky didn't look up, his hands still gripping the edge of the counter. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want any of this. I didn't want to get anyone hurt." Jack could see the guilt written all over his face, but there was something else there too. Fear. Fear of the people who had chased him, and of what would happen next. "You didn't ask for any of this," Jack said, his voice calm. "But you've got a chance to make it right now. You can either keep running, or you can face what's coming." Ricky's eyes flicked up, and for the first time, Jack saw a glimmer of resolve in them. It was a fragile thing, but it was there. The kid was learning, slowly, what it meant to take responsibility for his choices. The waitress glanced between Jack and Ricky, then sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. "You know, I've seen a lot of things in my time working here. A lot of bad people walk through that door. But you two? I don't know. You're both walking a fine line, and I don't know if you're going to make it." Jack didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. He had seen enough to know that this was the kind of life people stumbled into, whether they were looking for it or not. But Ricky still had a chance to turn things around. He turned to leave, but before he did, he glanced over his shoulder at the waitress. "If you ever need help around here again, just let me know." She nodded, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "I'll keep that in mind." Jack stepped out of the diner into the cool evening air, his mind racing. The confrontation was over for now, but the danger was far from gone. The stranger hadn't been bluffing, and Jack knew it. He turned his attention back to the road ahead, his thoughts on Ricky and the path he'd have to take to survive. Jack didn't know where this was going, but he had a feeling that things were just starting to get complicated. The cool night air hit Jack's face as he stepped out of the diner, his boots clicking softly against the cracked pavement. The sound felt oddly reassuring, steadying him as his mind spun with the events of the past hour. He had expected trouble, but the encounter with the gang had been more intense than he'd anticipated. And that waitress, she wasn't just some innocent bystander. She was a force to be reckoned with. Jack found himself curious about her, wondering what her story was. But his focus quickly shifted back to the task at hand. The danger hadn't passed yet. The gang's leader, that cold-eyed stranger, had made it clear this wasn't over. And Jack knew he wouldn't be able to walk away from this without more trouble on the horizon. He turned toward the truck stop parking lot, his eyes scanning the long row of semi-trucks, their engines idling as drivers took breaks. The silence of the night felt heavy, almost suffocating. His mind drifted back to Ricky. The kid was scared, but Jack could see a flicker of resolve in his eyes. That was something, maybe even enough to keep him alive. As Jack reached his truck, he saw the shadow of a figure approaching from the corner of his eye. Instinctively, his hand went to the small of his back, where the comforting weight of his pistol rested. But when he turned to face the figure, his muscles relaxed slightly. It was the waitress. She was walking toward him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. There was a determined look in her eyes, but she wasn't rushing. She approached with the same quiet confidence she had shown inside the diner. "You heading out?" she asked, her voice steady, but there was a hint of something more behind it. Worry? Curiosity? Maybe both. Jack nodded, glancing at his truck. "Yeah, I need to get on the road. I don't think sticking around here is a good idea for either of us." She stopped a few feet away, folding her arms across her chest. "You're right. It's not safe here. Those guys won't stop after what happened tonight. You might want to take that kid with you. He doesn't belong here." Jack studied her for a moment. There was something in the way she spoke that made him think she knew more than she was letting on. She wasn't just concerned about Ricky's safety. There was an edge to her words, as if she understood exactly what kind of danger was waiting for them if they stayed. "I don't know if he's ready to leave," Jack said, his gaze flicking to the diner, where the lights still shone softly through the windows. "He's got a lot to figure out, but I'm not going to let him get hurt. Not if I can help it." The waitress nodded, her gaze flicking toward the diner as well. "You should take him somewhere safer. I know a place a few hours out of town. It's not much, but it's quiet, and the kind of people who won't ask questions." Jack raised an eyebrow. "You know a place like that?" She smiled faintly, but there was a hardness to it, as though it had been a long time since she trusted anyone. "I've been around long enough to know where the trouble doesn't follow. And trust me, if you keep driving, you'll find it. Stay here, and it's only a matter of time before that gang comes back for you." Jack thought about it for a moment. The idea of a quiet, off-the-beaten-path place was tempting, especially if it meant Ricky would have a chance to lay low for a while. But there was something about the way she spoke that made Jack think she wasn't just offering a place to stay. She was trying to tell him something more than just directions to a safe spot. "And you? What's your plan?" Jack asked, his voice softening slightly. "You don't seem like the type to just sit back and let things happen. Are you planning on leaving this place too?" She hesitated, her gaze flicking down to the ground for a moment before looking up again. "I've been thinking about it. Maybe it's time. But I'm not going anywhere until I know things are settled. Those guys aren't going to give up easily. They'll be back for more." Jack didn't miss the way her jaw tightened, as though she was bracing for something. She wasn't just worried about the gang. She was worried about herself too, but she wasn't showing it. She was smart, capable, and she had the look of someone who'd survived her fair share of hard times. "I can't promise things will be settled tonight," Jack said, his voice low, "but I'll take you up on that offer. I'll take Ricky somewhere safe, and then we'll figure out what to do next." She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You'll find it on Route 82, just past the old gas station. Don't take the main road. It's safer through the back roads." Jack hesitated for a moment, then gave a small nod. "All right, I'll get going in the morning, but you should come with us. It's not safe here for you either." She shook her head. "I've got work to do here. Besides, I can handle myself." Jack didn't argue. There was a fierce pride in her words, something that told him she wasn't the kind to back down easily. He respected that, but it also made him uneasy. She was playing a dangerous game, and he wasn't sure if it was one she could win alone. "I'll keep the offer open," Jack said, turning toward his truck. "But if you change your mind, you know where to find us." She gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile before turning to walk back toward the diner. Jack watched her for a moment, feeling a strange sense of gratitude mixed with worry. There was something more to her than met the eye. He was sure of it. He climbed into his truck and started the engine, the rumble of the diesel engine filling the silence of the night. The road ahead was dark, but he knew it wasn't just the night that was dangerous. It was the unknown. Ricky was still sitting in the diner, clearly rattled, and Jack had to figure out what to do with him. The kid had no idea what kind of trouble he had walked into, but Jack did. The gang would be back, and when they were, there wouldn't be any more room for mistakes. The engine of Jack's truck hummed steadily as he pulled out of the parking lot, the headlights cutting through the darkness like twin beacons. He was used to driving long stretches of road in the dead of night, but tonight felt different. There was an urgency to his every move, a weight that hadn't been there before. The sound of the engine almost drowned out the thoughts racing through his mind. The waitress had given him directions to the safe spot, a quiet place just outside town, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story than she had let on. He knew the kind of people who worked at places like this, and they didn't just offer help without reason. He glanced over at Ricky, who sat hunched in the passenger seat, his face pale and drawn. The kid had barely spoken since they left the diner. Jack had told him to try and rest, but Ricky had only nodded in reply, his eyes constantly darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. Every now and then, his hand would subconsciously drift to the pocket where he kept the small, crumpled letter that had started all of this. It was a letter from someone in the past, someone Ricky was desperate to forget. "I don't want any trouble," Ricky had repeated over and over when Jack had asked him what was going on. But Jack wasn't about to let him off that easy. Not after the gang had come after him like that. After a few more miles of silence, Jack broke the quiet. "You ever been in trouble like this before?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Ricky didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared out the window, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon, as if trying to find an answer in the rolling landscape. Jack knew the kid was torn between speaking his mind and keeping everything locked up tight. But Jack had learned over the years that silence in the face of danger was a bad sign. It usually meant something worse was coming, and it was better to face it head-on. Ricky shifted in his seat, running a hand through his messy hair. "I've been in trouble, but nothing like this. These guys, they're different. They don't let things go." Jack could hear the fear in his voice now, the tremor that had been missing earlier. It wasn't the kind of fear that came from a simple fight or a close call. It was the kind of fear that came from knowing you'd crossed a line that couldn't be undone. "You ran from something," Jack said, keeping his eyes on the road. "What was it? Who were you running from?" Ricky swallowed hard. I don't know. I had to get out of there. Things were bad, and I thought I could start fresh. But then, I found that letter." He trailed off, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack raised an eyebrow, glancing over at the kid. "What letter?" Ricky hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the crumpled paper. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded it, and for a moment, Jack saw something in his eyes. Something like shame, or regret, or maybe both. "It's from a guy I used to know," Ricky said, his voice low. "He was a part of that gang. He said I owed him, and if I didn't pay, they were going to come after me. He gave me this address, told me to go there if I wanted to settle things. But I couldn't. I couldn't do it. I ran instead." Jack took the letter from Ricky's trembling hands and looked at it briefly. It was old, the paper yellowed, the ink smudged in places. But one thing was clear. This was no ordinary gang. The kind of people Ricky had gotten tangled with were ruthless. They didn't let things slide, especially if there was money or something else at stake. "You didn't have a choice, kid," Jack said, his tone softer now. "You did what you had to do. But running, that just brings more trouble. These guys are going to find you, whether you want them to or not. You have to face them eventually." Ricky shook his head, eyes wide with panic. "No, I can't. I can't go back to that life. I don't know what they want from me, but I can't be a part of that anymore. I'm not the same person I was back then. I swear." Jack understood. He wasn't the same person he'd been either. The past had a way of shaping you, making you into something you never thought you could be, but it didn't have to define you. Ricky could change his path, but only if he made the choice. The kid was still stuck in that moment of indecision. He couldn't decide whether to run or stand his ground. Jack's voice dropped to a near whisper. "You don't have to go back to them. You don't have to live in fear of them forever. But you're going to have to face them sooner or later. And when you do, you need to be ready. For anything." Ricky didn't respond immediately. He was staring at the road, his jaw clenched as he processed Jack's words. After a few moments, he nodded slightly, as if coming to a silent agreement with himself. "You really think I can face them?" Ricky asked, his voice barely audible. Jack's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he made a sharp turn onto a narrow dirt road. "I don't know, kid, but I do know that running never works. The only way out is through. So, we'll get you somewhere safe for tonight, and tomorrow, we'll figure it out. But you've got to decide what kind of man you're going to be. The guy who runs, or the guy who stands up for himself." Ricky seemed to take comfort in Jack's words, though his eyes were still shadowed with doubt. Jack could see it in the kid's face. The the fear of not being able to handle whatever was coming next. But Jack had seen enough men like Ricky to know that fear could either cripple you or drive you to do things you never thought you were capable of. As they drove deeper into the night, the landscape became more desolate. The road grew narrower, and the trees closed in around them, casting long, eerie shadows across the path. The safe place the waitress had mentioned was supposed to be just a few miles ahead, but Jack knew better than to think they were out of danger yet. They were both running from something, and no matter how far they went, the past had a way of catching up. Jack didn't know if he was ready for what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for sure. Ricky had a long way to go before he could shake the shadows of his past. The truck's headlights illuminated the small cabin up ahead, the only sign of life in the middle of nowhere. Jack pulled up, stopping just short of the dirt driveway. He cut the engine, the silence of the night suddenly more oppressive without the hum of the motor. "We're here," he said, glancing over at Ricky, who had barely moved during the ride. "For tonight, at least. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what's next." Ricky nodded slowly, his face hardening into something more determined than before. Jack could see the decision had been made. They were both going to face what was coming. The air was thick with silence when Jack killed the engine of his truck, the deep rumble of the diesel fading into the oppressive stillness of the night. The small cabin sat at the edge of the forest, surrounded by nothing but dense trees and a dirt path that seemed to stretch endlessly into the shadows. It wasn't much, but it was far enough from town to offer a brief reprieve from the trouble they were running from. Jack stepped out of the truck, feeling the cool night air wrap around him like a blanket. He surveyed the area, dark, quiet, isolated. It was the perfect place to lay low, at least for now. The faint rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl were the only sounds that broke the silence, and Jack found a strange comfort in it. This wasn't the kind of place you'd find a gang of bikers stalking you, but it also wasn't the kind of place that promised safety for long. Ricky didn't say anything as he climbed out of the passenger side. He looked around the cabin with a mixture of skepticism and relief, as if he wasn't sure whether to feel safe or trapped. The kid had been through too much in the past few days to fully relax, but Jack could see the weariness in his face. He was exhausted, physically and mentally, and he needed rest. But Jack knew better than to think that rest was all Ricky needed. They were both on borrowed time. The bikers wouldn't let this go. They'd be back, and when they came, it wouldn't be a simple confrontation. Jack wasn't sure what the bikers wanted with Ricky, but he knew the kind of trouble they were dealing with. They weren't the kind to walk away once they'd marked someone. "You all right?" Jack asked, his voice breaking the silence as he turned toward the kid. Ricky nodded, but his eyes betrayed him. He wasn't all right. Jack had seen that look before. He had worn it himself in the past. It was the look of someone who was running from more than just physical danger. It was the look of someone who had lost something and was afraid they might never get it back. "I'll be fine," Ricky said quietly, his voice lacking conviction. "Just tired." Jack didn't push him. They both knew what the real issue was, and there was no point in forcing the conversation. Ricky would talk when he was ready. For now, Jack needed to focus on keeping them both safe. The cabin wasn't much. A small, weathered structure with peeling paint and a sagging roof. But it had a front porch, and there was a swing hanging from the porch beam, creaking softly in the breeze. A faint smell of pine and damp earth filled the air, grounding Jack in the moment. This place had been untouched by the chaos of their lives, and for the first time in a long while, Jack felt like they could breathe. "Let's get inside," Jack said, motioning toward the door. "We'll figure things out in the morning." Ricky followed him up the steps, and Jack opened the door. The inside was modest: an old couch, a couple of mismatched chairs, and a small kitchenette. Nothing fancy, but it was clean and functional. There was a small wood stove in the corner, its blackened surface a reminder of colder nights. A single light bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting a dim glow over the room. Jack went straight to the stove and started a small fire, the crackling sound filling the otherwise quiet space. He moved through the motions like it was second nature, gathering logs, feeding the fire, and then standing back to watch as the flames flickered to life. There was something almost meditative about it, a brief moment of control in a world that had long since spun out of his grasp. Ricky was standing near the window, looking out into the dark woods, his eyes distant. Jack didn't interrupt him. He had learned the hard way that some things, like grief, fear, and uncertainty, needed space to work themselves out. After a few moments, Ricky finally spoke, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "Do you think they'll find us here?" he asked, his eyes still fixed on the trees outside. Jack glanced over, his expression hardening. "They'll try, but we've got a bit of a head start. If they come, we'll be ready." Ricky turned, his face etched with unease. "What if we're not? What if I'm not ready? I can't go back to that life, Jack. I just can't." Jack stepped toward him, his tone firm but understanding. "You don't have to go back, Ricky. I told you, we're not going to let them control you anymore. But you need to decide who you're going to be. You can't keep running, because that's not going to work forever." Ricky's eyes darted around the cabin, like he was looking for an escape route that didn't exist. "I don't even know what I'm supposed to do. How do I face them after everything I've done?" Jack looked him dead in the eye, his voice steady. "You face them with who you are right now, not who you were. That's the only choice you've got. You don't have to be that person anymore, but you have to own it." The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of Jack's words. Ricky looked down, his jaw clenched as he wrestled with the reality of it all. He didn't say anything for a long time, and Jack didn't expect him to. They had time to figure it out. For now, they were safe here. A knock on the door interrupted the silence, making both men jump. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, slow, rhythmic. Jack's hand instinctively went to the handle of his pistol, but he hesitated. It could be anyone, or it could be someone they didn't want to see. Ricky's eyes widened, and he stepped back toward the wall, his body tense. Jack took a deep breath and moved cautiously toward the door. He kept his hand close to his gun, but he didn't pull it out yet. He opened the door a crack, just enough to see who was on the other side. His eyes met the shadowy figure standing there, and his heart skipped a beat. It was the waitress. Her face was lit by the dim light from the cabin, her expression serious, and her eyes scanning the darkness behind her. She stepped forward slightly, and Jack could see she was carrying a small duffel bag. "You're going to need this," she said, her voice low and urgent. Jack didn't move. "What are you doing here?" "I thought—" "There's no time for talking," she interrupted. "The bikers, they're coming. I know you're trying to lay low, but this place won't stay hidden for long. They know about it. They've got eyes everywhere." Jack's stomach dropped. This wasn't a warning anymore. It was a countdown. Jack stood frozen in the doorway, the weight of the waitress's words sinking in like a stone dropped into deep water. The bikers knew where they were. He could feel his pulse quicken, the familiar tension creeping into his shoulders. The air around him suddenly felt thick and heavy, the quiet of the cabin a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. Ricky, standing just inside the door, instinctively took a step closer to Jack. His eyes were wide, his expression a mix of confusion and fear. "How do you know that?" Jack asked, his voice low but sharp, trying to make sense of it all. The waitress looked around, her gaze sweeping over the dark woods and the dimly lit cabin. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, pulling the duffel bag with her. There was a sense of urgency in her movements, and for the first time, Jack saw something in her eyes that wasn't just concern. It was fear. Genuine, raw fear. "Because I used to work for them," she said quietly, setting the duffel bag down on the floor. "I know how they operate. I know how they track people. And I know they won't stop until they get what they want." Jack took a sharp breath, his mind racing. He didn't like the way this was going. If she'd worked for the bikers, that meant she knew their methods, their people, possibly even their leader. But if she was telling the truth, if they were really this close to being found, then they were running out of time. The window for escape was closing fast. "You worked for them?" Ricky asked, his voice shaky. "What do you mean? Why would you help us now?" The waitress's face softened, but her eyes remained hard, as if she was struggling with her own demons. "I didn't have a choice back then. I owed them, but I'm done with them. I can't keep running from my past, and I can't let them do what they're planning to do to you." Jack studied her carefully, trying to read her. She seemed sincere, but sincerity didn't always mean safety. People lied. even when their lives were on the line. "Why come now?" Jack asked, his voice gruff. "You could have stayed out of it. You didn't have to warn us." She shrugged, a bitter smile flickering on her lips. "I couldn't just let you walk into it. You'd be dead before you even knew what hit you. I know how they move. They've got scouts out here, watching every road, every turn. They'll be here before dawn." Ricky's face had gone pale. He turned to Jack, his voice desperate. "What do we do now? If they're coming, we can't just stay here. We'll be trapped." Jack clenched his jaw, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a vice. The kid was right. Staying in the cabin was no longer an option. The bikers would find them, and the moment they did, it was over. "Grab your things," Jack said, his tone commanding. "We're moving. The road's the only chance we've got now." Ricky nodded, but there was still a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "What about the duffel bag?" he asked, glancing at the bag the waitress had left by the door. The waitress gave a short, almost humorless laugh. "It's everything I could grab. Cash, food, a few weapons. It's not much, but it might help you get out of here." Jack didn't waste time. He picked up the bag and threw it over his shoulder, the weight of it adding to the urgency of their situation. They couldn't afford to be cautious anymore. They had to move, and they had to move fast. "Stay close," Jack ordered as he reached for the door. "We'll head for the back exit. The front's too obvious." Ricky didn't need any more convincing. He followed Jack as they both stepped out into the cool night air, the crunch of gravel beneath their boots the only sound breaking the silence. The woods around them felt darker now, the shadows stretching longer and deeper as they moved farther away from the cabin. The waitress followed behind them, her pace quick but measured. She didn't say much more, but Jack could tell she was on edge. They all were. The looming threat of the bikers was enough to keep them all tense, every step filled with the fear of being discovered. "We can't keep running," Ricky muttered under his breath, barely loud enough for Jack to hear. "We can't outrun them forever." Jack gave a grim nod but said nothing. The road ahead was uncertain, and they were already far too deep in it to turn back now. They had to make it to safety, and the only way out was forward. The group made their way deeper into the woods, moving cautiously at first but picking up the pace as the minutes dragged on. They needed to get to the nearest highway, where they could steal a ride or figure out their next move. The woods offered cover for now, but it wouldn't last. The bikers knew how to track people. They knew how to flush them out. "Where are we going?" Ricky asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Keep moving," Jack replied, his eyes scanning the trees around them. "There's a road about 3 miles east. We'll head there and try to find a ride. Then we'll figure out our next step." But even as he said it, Jack knew they didn't have the luxury of figuring things out one step at a time. They were running out of time, and no matter how fast they moved, the bikers would be right behind them. The trees began to thin, and ahead, Jack could see the faint outline of a trail leading toward a small clearing. He motioned for Ricky and the waitress to stay low, and they crouched behind a thick patch of bushes, waiting in silence. Jack's heart was pounding in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. And then, just as the clearing opened up ahead, a rustle came from behind them, followed by the unmistakable sound of a motorcycle revving in the distance. "They're close," Jack muttered, his voice tense. "Get ready." Ricky's eyes widened in fear, and for a moment, Jack saw the kid's true panic. He wasn't ready for this, but Jack had no choice. There was no more running. It was time to stand and face what was coming. The sound of the bike grew louder, and the unmistakable roar of a few more engines followed. Jack's hand instinctively went to the grip of his gun. They were about to be outnumbered. "This is it," Jack said, his voice steady. "Stay behind me. Don't make a sound unless I say so." The wind whistled through the trees as they crouched, holding their breath, the sound of the approaching bikes echoing in the night. The rumble of the motorcycles grew louder as the bikes tore down the dirt road, their engines cutting through the silence of the forest like a predator honing in on its prey. Jack's hand tightened around the grip of his gun. His senses sharpened to the point where he could hear every branch crack underfoot, every gust of wind whispering through the leaves. He motioned for Ricky and the waitress to stay low, as if the act of hiding behind the bushes could somehow shield them from the danger drawing closer. The moment felt frozen in time, an eerie stillness hanging in the air, broken only by the sound of the approaching bikes. Jack's eyes darted back and forth, scanning the edges of the forest. There was no question now. They were being hunted, and the bikers were getting closer by the second. "Stay quiet," Jack whispered harshly, his voice barely audible. His heartbeat was steady, but he could feel the blood rushing in his ears as adrenaline flooded his system. The sound of the motorcycles grew sharper, closer now, their engines throttling harder as they reached the clearing where Jack, Ricky, and the waitress were hiding. Jack knew they couldn't stay here. The bikers would fan out, sweeping through the forest until they found them. They had to make a move. The bike slowed, and Jack's heart skipped a beat. The riders were circling the area. He could make out the faint outline of their figures through the thick trees, silhouettes in the dim light of the moon. The bikers didn't seem to be in a hurry. They were taking their time, as if they knew their quarry couldn't hide forever. "They're here," Ricky breathed, his voice trembling. Jack clenched his jaw and motioned for the waitress to move behind him. She hesitated for a second, but then nodded, her face grim. "I can lead them away. Give you some time," she whispered. Jack turned to face her. "No," he said sharply. "You'll only make things worse. We need to stick together." The waitress met his eyes with a resigned look. "They're going to find us, Jack. The only way we get out of this is to confuse them. Lead them on a chase. Split them up." Jack knew she was right. If they stayed together, they'd be easy targets. But splitting up? That was a dangerous gamble. Before he could respond, a voice rang out from the clearing. It was deep, gravelly, with an air of authority. Come out, wherever you are." Jack's muscles tensed. He didn't recognize the voice, but it wasn't the first time he'd heard a tone like that, arrogant, mocking, like they had all the time in the world. The bikers were toying with them. "Damn it," Jack muttered. "They've already spotted the truck. We don't have much time." There was a rustle in the bushes ahead, and one of the bikers appeared, a hulking figure silhouetted against the moonlight. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a leather jacket adorned with patches Jack didn't recognize. His face was obscured by a dark helmet, but the eyes, those eyes, stared at them with a predatory gleam. Jack's grip on his gun tightened, but he didn't make a move. Not yet. They were outnumbered. One mistake and it was over. "Come on out. We know you're there," the biker shouted again, his voice taunting. "We've got a little unfinished business." Jack's mind raced. The biker's words sent a chill through him. Unfinished business? He couldn't afford to think about it. Not now. They had to keep moving. Then, as if on cue, the biker motioned behind him, and two more figures emerged from the shadows, stepping into the moonlight. They were dressed in the same worn leather, their faces covered by helmets, but their posture, their movements, gave away their experience. These weren't just any bikers. These were professionals, mercenaries, the kind who didn't take failure lightly. "We're not here to play games, old man," the first biker said. His voice was low, edged with something dangerously calm. "We know who you are, and we know what you've done. You've got a debt to pay." Jack's blood ran cold. The weight of the words hit him like a punch to the gut. He knew exactly what the biker meant. "You don't know anything about me," Jack shot back, his voice steady despite the rising storm in his chest. He stood tall, his presence undeniable. "I'm not your problem, but if you keep pushing, I will be." The biker chuckled, the sound deep and guttural. "You think you can scare us, old man? You think you can just walk away from what's coming? You're running out of places to hide." Before Jack could respond, the waitress acted. In one fluid motion, she dashed out of the bushes and sprinted toward the opposite side of the clearing. The biker's attention immediately snapped to her as she broke for cover, her footsteps heavy but fast. "After her," the first biker barked, pointing at her retreating form. Jack didn't hesitate. The moment the bikers turned their attention away, he grabbed Ricky's arm, pulling him to his feet. "Move now." The two of them bolted for the tree line, weaving between the trunks of the dense forest, their steps muffled by the thick underbrush. Behind them, the sound of engines roared to life, the bikers hot on their heels. "We can't outrun them forever," Ricky panted, his voice laced with panic. "We don't have to outrun them," Jack replied, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. We just need to make sure they lose us. The ground was uneven beneath their feet as they sprinted through the woods, twisting and turning at random. Jack didn't stop to check if the bikers were still following them. He couldn't afford to waste time. Every second counted. They had to reach the road, had to find a way out. As they ran, Jack's mind whirred with possibilities. The waitress had given them a chance, a small window of opportunity to get away. But the bikers were ruthless. They wouldn't stop until they had both Ricky and Jack in their hands, and Jack wasn't ready to lose anyone. Not now, not ever. Suddenly, a shot rang out, the crack of a rifle splitting the night air. It was followed by the sound of tires screeching on gravel. "They're here," Jack muttered. The bikers were closing in. The shot echoed through the trees, its sharp crack hanging in the air long after it had fired. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he instinctively ducked lower, pulling Ricky behind him. The sound of the rifle shot wasn't a random warning. It was a declaration. The bikers were getting serious. "We're not going to outrun them now," Jack said through clenched teeth, trying to keep his voice calm, but the desperation in it was undeniable. Every instinct told him to keep running, to put as much distance between them and the bikers as possible. But he knew better than to run blindly into the night. "We need to make a stand," Jack continued, scanning their surroundings. The forest ahead was dense with underbrush, and the darkness seemed to close in around them. The trees were their only cover, but it wouldn't last long. The bikers were closing in fast, and once they had them in their sights, it was all over. "We can't outrun them, Jack," Ricky protested, his voice frantic. "They're going to catch us." Jack ignored him, his mind racing. There was no time for panic. He had to think. He had to make them believe they weren't the easy targets they thought they were. "Stay behind me," Jack ordered, his tone firm. Ricky nodded, but Jack could see the fear in his eyes. He wasn't a soldier, not like Jack. He didn't know what it felt like to be hunted, to know that at any moment the situation could turn deadly. "Don't move until I say so," Jack added. "If you do, they'll see us." Ricky nodded again, but Jack could tell he was already tense, ready to bolt at the slightest noise. They had to be smart. He couldn't afford to let this kid panic. Not now. They crouched behind a thick tree, Jack's back pressed against the rough bark. He drew his gun, checking the clip. He didn't want to use it unless absolutely necessary, but if the bikers came too close, there would be no choice. The sound of the motorcycles grew louder, the growl of the engines unmistakable as the bikers closed the distance between them. Jack's eyes flicked to Ricky, who was trembling, his eyes wide and wild with fear. "Jack, they're coming," Ricky whispered, barely audible. Jack raised a hand, signaling for Ricky to stay silent. The bikes were almost upon them now, and the tension in the air was unbearable. Jack could hear the engines revving, the familiar sound of tires spinning against gravel. They were moving fast, and the bikers were determined. But Jack wasn't about to make it easy for them. From the corner of his eye, he saw the first biker appear in the clearing, his silhouette emerging from the darkness. He was moving cautiously, scanning the area, but Jack wasn't where he expected them to be. The biker was looking in the wrong direction. "Stay low," Jack hissed, as he slowly moved to another tree, keeping his body pressed to the ground, his movements as silent as possible. The bikers had split up, no longer riding in a tight formation. They were searching for them, covering more ground, hoping to flush them out. Jack cursed under his breath. It was only a matter of time before one of them found them. As Jack moved, he kept an eye on the biker who had just entered the clearing. He had a chance, a small window to strike. But the moment he moved, Ricky was going to be exposed. The kid wasn't ready for a gunfight, and Jack wasn't about to throw him into the fire. Just as he was about to make a decision, the second biker appeared, his form emerging from the shadows, a little farther off to the left. The two of them were closer now. Too close? "Jack, what do we do?" Ricky whispered urgently, his eyes flicking from the bikers back to Jack. Jack didn't respond immediately. He was focused on the bikers, his mind racing through options. If they stayed here, they would be spotted. If they ran, they would be caught. But there was one thing they could do: create a diversion. "Take cover," Jack said suddenly, pulling Ricky behind a large tree. On my signal, run east. Don't look back. Just run. Ricky's face was pale, but he didn't argue. He trusted Jack, and that was all Jack needed. The bikers were closing in, and Jack had only seconds to act. He drew a deep breath, his finger on the trigger of his gun, his eyes narrowing on the nearest biker. The moment he moved, he would be ready. The first biker turned his head slightly, glancing around, his helmet gleaming in the moonlight. Jack could see the reflection of the trees in the visor, the silhouette of his target clear in his sights. The second biker was farther off, but Jack wasn't sure how long it would take him to close in. He counted to 3 in his head. 1, 2. The biker stepped forward. Without hesitation, Jack fired a warning shot into the air, the sound of the gunshot cracking through the quiet night like thunder. The biker immediately ducked, his hand reaching for his weapon. The second biker reacted too, his head whipping toward the noise. But it was already too late. Jack was on the move. Go! Jack shouted to Ricky as he fired another shot in the air, making the bikers flinch. Ricky bolted, running as fast as he could, but Jack wasn't far behind. They had to move fast, or it would be over. The first biker cursed loudly, his eyes scanning the woods as he fired a shot in their direction, the bullet zipping past Jack's head. He felt the wind rush by his ear as he ducked instinctively, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. They ran, pushing themselves harder, adrenaline coursing through their veins. The trees whipped past them, the ground uneven and treacherous beneath their feet. Jack kept his eyes forward, his focus entirely on the road ahead. He could hear the engines of the bikes behind them, but the noise was fading. They were losing ground. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jack allowed himself to believe they might make it out of this. Then, in the distance, he saw the glow of headlights cutting through the night, coming straight toward them. The headlights grew brighter, cutting through the darkened woods like a pair of ominous eyes hunting them down. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he and Ricky sprinted through the forest, their footsteps almost drowned by the roar of the bikes closing in from behind. The sound of the engines was deafening now, like a relentless wave crashing down on them. They're not giving up? Ricky gasped, his breath ragged as he struggled to keep up. Jack didn't respond. There was no time for words. The glow of the headlights was drawing closer, and he could tell they had just moments before the bikers would be right on top of them. If they didn't do something now, they wouldn't get away. Get to the road, Jack barked, his voice sharp. Now. Ricky's eyes widened in fear, but he nodded and veered off to the left, pushing through the underbrush toward the narrow dirt road Jack had spotted earlier. The road could be their only chance at escape, if they could make it there before the bikers surrounded them. Jack followed closely, staying low to the ground, but his mind was already racing. The bike engines were too close. He could hear their growls behind them, too loud now to ignore. They weren't far off. They reached the edge of the woods, and Jack's eyes locked on the dirt road that snaked through the trees. The headlights of the motorcycles were just around the corner, and in the distance, he could make out the silhouette of a lone truck parked off to the side, likely abandoned by someone who had stopped for the night. "We can make it," Ricky shouted, but there was a hint of panic in his voice. "We just need to reach that truck." Jack didn't have to be told twice. With a burst of energy, he surged forward, pushing Ricky ahead of him. The sound of the bikes grew deafening. 1, 2, then 3 riders appeared at the clearing's edge, their bikes kicking up gravel and dust. Jack's heart raced, but he knew they had one shot at this. "Get in the truck," Jack ordered as they reached the dirt road, pointing toward the vehicle. "Now." The truck was an old beater, its metal frame rusty and covered in dust, but it was their lifeline. Ricky didn't hesitate this time. He rushed to the driver's side door, grabbing the handle and throwing himself into the cab. Jack followed, slamming the door shut behind him. Before they could even catch their breath, the roar of the motorcycles reached a crescendo. The bikers were here. Jack's hand instinctively reached for the door handle, but he didn't open it. Not yet. They were trapped. "Go!" Jack shouted, turning to Ricky. "Drive!" Ricky's eyes were wide with terror as he fumbled for the keys. His hands were shaking, and the sound of the bikes getting closer made his panic even worse. He glanced at Jack, as if looking for reassurance, but Jack's face was grim. "Start the damn truck, Ricky." Jack barked again, his patience running out. The sound of engines revving grew louder, and Jack could feel the heat of the headlights as the bikers approached. He didn't know how much longer they could hold out. The bikers were too close. Finally, with a sputter, the truck came to life. Ricky slammed the gearshift into drive, and they lurched forward, the tires kicking up dirt as they sped down the road. But the bikers were right behind them. Jack turned to look over his shoulder just as the first of the bikers darted out from the trees, the engine of his bike growling like a beast hunting its prey. He was gaining on them. "Go faster," Jack yelled, his hand gripping the edge of the seat as the truck bounced over the rough terrain. Ricky's foot slammed on the gas pedal, and the truck lurched forward again, tires spinning, throwing up a cloud of dust behind them. Jack could hear the whine of the motorcycles pushing closer, their engines a symphony of chaos. It wouldn't take long for them to catch up. "Stay on the road," Jack ordered, his mind racing. "We need to keep them behind us, not let them pull alongside." Ricky was trying his best to keep control of the truck, but the dirt road was narrow and uneven. The tires slid, and the truck bucked beneath them, making it harder to maintain speed. Jack turned to look again, seeing the bikers closing in, the first rider weaving in and out, trying to cut them off. His fingers tightened around the grip of the door, ready to react at any second. "Take the next turn," Jack shouted as they approached a sharp bend in the road. The next few seconds felt like an eternity. If they could make that turn, they might gain enough distance to get away. But it wasn't that simple. As they reached the curve, Jack saw a flash of movement in his peripheral vision. Another biker had come up alongside them, moving fast, his engine roaring. The gap between them was closing rapidly. "Hold on," Jack yelled, bracing himself as Ricky jerked the wheel. The truck careened around the bend, the tires screaming in protest as they barely kept their grip on the road. They slid dangerously close to the edge, but Jack's instincts were sharp. He could feel the tension in the air as Ricky fought to keep the truck under control. Then, with a violent jolt, the bike came alongside them. The biker was too close, his face hidden behind his helmet, but Jack could see the malicious intent in his eyes. This wasn't just a chase, it was personal. Before Jack could react, the biker reached over and slammed his foot against the side of the truck, knocking it off course. Ricky struggled to regain control, but the truck swerved, almost going off the road entirely. Jack's pulse quickened. They couldn't afford any more mistakes. "Get off the damn road," Jack shouted at the biker, his voice hoarse. He threw open the door and braced himself as he prepared to make a move. The biker grinned, clearly enjoying the chase. But Jack wasn't about to let him get the upper hand. In one smooth motion, Jack swung his legs out of the truck and reached for the biker. With a swift move, he grabbed hold of the biker's shoulder, yanking him toward the truck, throwing him off balance. The biker's momentum carried him forward, and Jack slammed him into the side of the vehicle with a sickening thud. The biker let out a yell, but Jack didn't give him the chance to recover. He pulled himself back into the truck with one final push, slamming the door shut just as Ricky slammed the pedal to the floor. The truck roared forward again, and the road ahead seemed to open up, the danger still hot on their heels. They were almost free. Almost. The truck sped down the narrow dirt road, its engine roaring, tires kicking up gravel in the rearview mirror. Jack's heart was still pounding in his chest as he looked over at Ricky, who was gripping the wheel with white-knuckled intensity, his eyes wild with panic. The bikers had been temporarily shaken off, but Jack knew this wasn't over. "Keep going, Ricky. Don't stop," Jack urged, scanning the road ahead. Ricky's eyes flicked to Jack, fear written all over his face, but he nodded quickly. I'm trying, but I don't know how much farther this road goes. We don't have a choice. Just keep going." Jack was aware of the danger closing in. The roar of the motorcycles wasn't far behind, and the sound of the engines had begun to grow louder again. They'd made a few miles distance, but the bikers were relentless. Jack knew the kind of men they were dealing with. If they were determined, they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. And right now, what they wanted was Jack, and probably Ricky too, if they realized how much of a liability he was. "I don't think we can outrun them much longer," Ricky said, his voice shaking. "What do we do now?" Jack's mind raced. He needed to think fast. They had no weapon strong enough to stop the bikers if it came down to a gunfight. And they couldn't keep running forever. They needed a plan. We need to find a place to hide. A way to lose them, Jack said, his mind working rapidly. The road's winding. Maybe we can lose them in the next turn. But we need to slow them down first. Ricky nodded, eyes glued to the road. They were approaching another bend, one that seemed to cut deeper into the woods. It could be their best shot. Take the next turn hard, Jack instructed, and don't slow down. Ricky's knuckles whitened as he gripped the wheel tighter, and his foot pressed harder on the gas pedal. The truck shot forward, tires screeching against the gravel as they rounded the curve. The headlights of the motorcycles weren't visible yet, but Jack knew that they were close. If they didn't get out of sight, they'd be caught. They had one chance, one moment to disappear into the wilderness. And as the truck rounded the curve, Jack spotted a shadowy trail that seemed to veer off the road and into the trees, a path that had been carved into the landscape long ago. Pull onto that trail, Jack shouted. Ricky jerked the wheel, sending the truck flying off the main road and down the hidden trail. The tires hit the uneven ground, and the truck bounced wildly, but Ricky managed to keep control. They shot deeper into the forest, the truck's headlights cutting through the thick underbrush, illuminating nothing but the trees ahead. But Jack could hear the bikers. Their engines had grown closer again, the sound unmistakable. They had to be gaining on them. They needed to get off this trail and into the cover of the trees. Stop here, Jack commanded. Ricky slammed on the brakes, and the truck screeched to a halt in the middle of the forest. The headlights illuminated the thick canopy of trees surrounding them, casting long shadows across the ground. Jack immediately jumped out of the truck, motioning for Ricky to follow. What now? Ricky asked, breathless, his eyes darting nervously toward the road. We hide, Jack said grimly. We wait. Jack grabbed Ricky's arm and pulled him behind a large cluster of trees, out of sight from the road. The bikes were close, too close. Jack could hear them roaring through the night, the sound echoing off the trees as they searched for them. Do you have a weapon? Ricky whispered urgently, looking at Jack. Jack shook his head. No, but we can't fight them head-on. We just need to stay quiet. The two men crouched low to the ground, listening as the motorcycles grew closer, their engines growing louder and louder. Jack's mind was focused entirely on the sounds, the vibrations in the air. He could feel the rumble of the engines through the ground beneath him. The bikers were coming. They weren't far now. Jack's eyes flicked toward Ricky. The young man's eyes were wide with fear, his breathing shallow. This wasn't the life he was used to, and Jack could see the uncertainty in his eyes. But now was no time for doubts. They had to be still. They had to be patient. As the bikers passed, Jack held his breath, hoping against hope that they wouldn't notice the truck parked just off the trail. But the motorcycles didn't stop. They kept going, their engines fading into the distance. Jack exhaled, silently relieved. He waited for a moment, allowing the sound of the bikes to dissipate into the night. When he felt certain they were gone, Jack slowly stood up, signaling for Ricky to follow. They're gone, Jack whispered. For now. But they'll be back. Ricky stood cautiously, his body still tense. What do we do now? We need to keep moving, Jack said, his voice low but firm. We can't stay here. If we wait too long, they'll find us. But we don't know where we're going. The road's too dangerous, Ricky protested. Jack glanced around, considering the possibilities. There was a creek not far from here, one that led into a more heavily wooded area. It could be their best option for hiding. We go west. There's a creek down this way. We can follow it, find some cover. We'll keep moving until we're sure they've lost the trail. Ricky didn't argue, though Jack could see the fear in his eyes. The situation was grim, and both of them knew it. But Jack had survived worse. And Ricky, for better or for worse, was now in this with him. Stay close and stay quiet, Jack instructed. Let's move. The two men moved swiftly and silently through the woods, their steps soft on the leaf-strewn ground. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows on the forest floor. Every so often, Jack would glance over his shoulder, checking for signs of pursuit, but the night remained eerily quiet. They reached the creek after what felt like an eternity. The cool water babbled quietly in the moonlight, its surface shimmering as it wound through the dense trees. Jack crouched beside the water, listening carefully for any sounds of pursuit. Ricky followed suit, his eyes wide as he looked around nervously. "Do you think they've really lost us?" Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around, trying to get a sense of their surroundings. The creek was deep and winding, and if they followed it for a while, they could find a place to rest, maybe even lay low for a few hours. But they couldn't stop moving for long, not until they were sure they were safe. "I think we've bought ourselves some time," Jack said finally. "But we need to keep moving. They won't give up until they have us." Ricky nodded, but the fear in his eyes hadn't dissipated. Jack could see that the young man wasn't cut out for this kind of life, the constant tension, the ever-present danger. But Jack knew that, for now, they had no other choice. "Let's keep going," Jack said, and with one last glance at the creek, he led the way deeper into the woods. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, an endless sea of trees that whispered in the night wind. The creek wound through the landscape like a serpent, guiding Jack and Ricky deeper into the wilderness. They moved quietly, carefully, avoiding any unnecessary noise. Their footsteps were muffled by the soft earth beneath them, but Jack knew that at any moment their luck could run out. The bikers would come for them. It was only a matter of time. Ricky was trailing just behind Jack, his breathing still shallow, his steps hesitant. Jack could feel the younger man's unease. This wasn't just a run from danger, it was survival. And Ricky, for all his bravado earlier, was starting to realize how real the threat was. "How far do you think we can go?" Ricky asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Jack glanced back, his eyes scanning the darkened path ahead. The trees loomed like sentinels, blocking out most of the moonlight, making it hard to judge the distance. But Jack didn't need to see too far ahead to know what was at stake. "As far as we need to," Jack said, his voice steady. "We keep moving until we know we're safe. They can't keep tracking us forever." Ricky didn't seem convinced. He looked down at his worn boots and kicked a small rock out of his path. "I just don't get it, man. Why us? What do they want?" Jack kept walking without responding immediately. The question was one he'd been asking himself for days. Why did the bikers target him? Why hadn't they let up after all this time? He was just an old vet, trying to live out his days in peace. But for some reason, the past was coming back to haunt him. "They want what they can't have," Jack said after a long pause. "Power. Control. They think I've got something they can use." Ricky frowned. "But you don't, right?" Jack turned to face him, his gaze hard. "Doesn't matter what I have. They want to send a message. They'll keep coming until they get what they want." Ricky nodded, though he didn't look any more reassured. The air felt thick with tension. The sounds of the forest seemed to close in around them. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot made both men tense up, as if the bikers could be right behind them. "We can't keep running forever," Ricky muttered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "I mean, where are we even going?" Jack didn't answer immediately. He hadn't figured that part out yet. The wilderness was vast, but the longer they stayed out here, the more exhausted they'd become. They couldn't outrun the bikers forever. Eventually, they'd have to stand their ground. The question was, when and how? A distant sound pierced the quiet of the night. An engine. Low and steady at first, but unmistakable. The unmistakable roar of a motorcycle. Jack's body went rigid. He immediately motioned for Ricky to stop. Ricky froze, his wide eyes locking onto Jack's. "Get down," Jack hissed, pulling Ricky behind a thick tree trunk. They crouched low, their breath shallow, and waited. The sound of the approaching motorcycle grew louder. Jack's mind raced. Had they been found so quickly? Were there more bikers out here than they thought? The sound grew closer, and Jack could just make out the outline of a rider emerging from the trees in the distance. He looked over at Ricky, signaling him to stay silent, his finger pressed to his lips. They weren't safe yet. The rider came into view, but instead of seeing a group of bikers barreling down on them, Jack saw just one. The rider slowed as he neared the creek, his headlights cutting through the shadows, scanning the area. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. They were too close. The rider stopped at the creek's edge, the motorcycle engine idling softly in the night. Jack could hear his breathing, steady and calm, as the rider surveyed the area. Jack held his breath, his hand resting on the cold earth. Ricky was tense beside him, his eyes wide, but Jack's focus was entirely on the rider. What did this mean? Was the biker searching for them? Or was this some kind of checkpoint, a lone scout keeping watch for the rest of the gang? Jack didn't have time to figure it out. If they were spotted now, there was no way to escape. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing moved. The rider remained still, staring into the dark forest around him. The only sound was the faint whisper of the wind and the occasional rustle of branches. Jack could hear the faintest sounds of birds settling for the night, but in that stillness, every noise felt amplified. Finally, the biker revved the engine, breaking the silence like a thunderclap in the dead of night. Jack flinched, but the rider simply turned the motorcycle around and headed back down the trail. The sound of the engine faded, and with it, the immediate danger. Ricky let out a breath, the tension in his body finally easing. Jack remained still for a moment longer, listening for any signs of pursuit. But after a few minutes, it became clear that the biker wasn't returning. For now, they were safe. "Stay down," Jack whispered, his voice hoarse with tension. "Don't move until I say." Ricky nodded silently, his body still coiled tight. He was shaken, but Jack could tell that the near miss had given him the clarity he needed. They couldn't keep running like this, and they couldn't trust that the bikers wouldn't circle back. They had to act. Jack waited a few more minutes, then slowly rose to his feet, signaling for Ricky to follow. He didn't wait for any more questions. They had to keep moving. The night was still. The forest was quiet again, but Jack knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. They had to find a place to rest, regroup, and figure out what to do next. It wouldn't be long before the bikers realized they were still out there, and Jack couldn't let that happen. Not again. The silence of the forest was almost oppressive, like the calm before a storm. Jack and Ricky moved deeper into the woods, the shadows of the trees stretching out before them like dark fingers. The night air was cool, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and pine. Despite the peaceful surroundings, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that danger was lurking just beyond the next bend, that the bikers were still out there, hunting them. Ricky's steps were heavier now, more deliberate. His fear hadn't fully dissipated, but there was a certain resolve in the way he walked. He was starting to understand the gravity of their situation. Jack, for his part, remained as alert as ever, eyes scanning the forest around them, every rustle in the underbrush a potential threat. Jack led them to a small clearing by the creek where they could rest. The trees here were sparse enough to allow some moonlight to filter through, casting soft beams across the moss-covered ground. It was the best they could do, safe for now, but not for long. "We'll stay here for a bit," Jack said in a low voice. "Let's rest up. We'll need our strength." Ricky nodded, but his eyes kept darting around, unable to fully relax. He crouched down next to a rock, resting his hands on his knees, his body stiff with tension. "This is insane," Ricky muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did it get this bad? I thought we could just lay low for a while, but now they're chasing us through the woods. They won't stop until they get us, will they?" Jack's gaze turned distant, his mind flashing back to the past. His life as a veteran, the wars he'd fought, and the enemies he'd made. He had always known that someday, the ghosts would come for him. But he had never imagined they would come in the form of a gang of ruthless bikers. "No, they won't stop," Jack said, his voice rough. "But we can't stop either. As long as we keep moving, keep staying ahead of them, we've got a chance." Ricky looked up at him, his face a mix of disbelief and fear. "But we don't even know where we're going. We're just running blind." Jack didn't have an answer to that. He didn't know where they were headed, only that they had to keep moving, keep staying one step ahead. He couldn't afford to slow down now, not when the bikers were closing in, not when they were hunting him. Suddenly, Jack's instincts kicked in, and he froze, his body tense. Something wasn't right. He motioned for Ricky to be quiet, and the two of them crouched low to the ground, blending into the shadows of the trees. Jack's sharp eyes scanned the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. The night seemed too still, too quiet. A rustle of leaves. A snap of a twig. It was coming from ahead of them. "They're here," Jack whispered, his voice hard with urgency. Ricky's eyes widened in panic. "What do we do? Do we fight?" Jack shook his head. "We don't fight unless we have to. Just stay low and quiet." They both held their breath, barely daring to move. Jack's mind raced, calculating their options. The creek was behind them, and there was a narrow path to the left that led deeper into the woods. If they could make it there undetected, they might have a chance to slip away unnoticed. But the footsteps were getting closer. Too close. Jack's heart pounded as the figures of 3 men emerged from the shadows. Their faces were hidden by bandanas, but the weapons in their hands made their intentions clear. These were the bikers, no doubt about it. Jack recognized the tall one in the front, the leader of the pack, the one who had given the orders earlier. Behind him, 2 others flanked, their eyes scanning the area. They were searching for something, or someone. Jack's pulse quickened. The bikers were no more than 10 yards away now. He could hear their low voices, the rustling of their leather jackets as they moved. They were circling the area, methodical in their search. Jack looked at Ricky, who was holding his breath, barely daring to move. The young man's eyes were wide with fear, his body trembling. Jack could see the panic building inside him. Ricky couldn't hold it much longer. Jack could feel the tension in the air. If they didn't move now, they'd be caught. But just as Jack prepared to make his move, something unexpected happened. The first biker, the leader, stopped suddenly, his eyes narrowing as he looked directly at the spot where Jack and Ricky were hiding. Jack's stomach dropped. He had been spotted. "Over there!" the leader shouted, pointing directly toward the trees where Jack and Ricky crouched. Without a moment's hesitation, the bikers began to rush forward, their footsteps pounding the ground as they closed in on their target. Jack had no choice now. "Run!" he shouted to Ricky, his voice urgent. They both sprang to their feet, dashing toward the narrow path to the left. Jack's mind raced as he led Ricky through the trees, the sound of the bikers' pursuit hot on their heels. They could hear the roar of engines starting up behind them. The bikers weren't far off. They were closing in fast. Jack's lungs burned as they ran, the adrenaline pushing him forward. They had to get to the trail. They had to keep moving. They reached the trail just as the first motorcycle tore through the forest, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a spear. Jack pushed Ricky ahead of him, shoving him toward a dense thicket of trees on the other side of the trail. "Get in there," Jack commanded, his voice hard with authority. Ricky hesitated, but Jack didn't give him the chance to argue. He grabbed Ricky by the arm and forced him into the cover of the thick brush, where they both crouched low, holding their breath as the bikers sped past them. The roar of the engines was deafening as the motorcycles ripped through the trail, searching for their prey. Jack could feel his heart hammering in his chest, his body tense with the fight-or-flight response. But he knew they couldn't stay here long. They couldn't wait for the bikers to circle back. They had to act, and they had to act fast. As the last motorcycle disappeared from view, Jack looked at Ricky, his expression grim. "We've got one shot at this," he said. "We move now. Stay low, stay quiet, and don't stop." Ricky nodded, the fear still in his eyes, but also a glimmer of determination. Jack could see that the kid was learning. He was starting to understand the rules of survival. "Let's go," Jack said, and without another word, they slipped deeper into the forest, the night swallowing them whole. The woods were eerily quiet now, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant croak of a lone frog. The sense of danger still clung to the air like a thick fog, but for the moment, Jack and Ricky had managed to escape the bikers. They had made it deeper into the forest, far enough away to lose the trail, but Jack knew it wouldn't be long before the gang figured out where they were headed. The woods weren't the refuge they seemed. It was just a temporary hiding place. Jack kept moving, his senses on high alert. Every snap of a twig, every shifting shadow seemed to pull at his nerves. He was used to combat, to danger. This wasn't his first rodeo, but the relentless pursuit by the bikers was different. It wasn't just about survival. It was personal now. They were hunting him, and until he figured out why, until he understood what they wanted from him, he couldn't rest. Ricky, trailing just behind, was still struggling to keep up. He hadn't been in this kind of danger before, and the constant tension was wearing on him. Jack could see the younger man's face twisted with fear, but also with something else, a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. "Jack!" Ricky's voice was barely audible, but the desperation in it was clear. "What's going on? Why are they after you? Who are these guys?" Jack paused, his eyes scanning the area around them. They were in a dense part of the forest now, the trees thick enough to block most of the moonlight, leaving them in a patch of near-total darkness. He needed to tell Ricky something. Anything that would ease his mind, help him understand, but it wasn't the right time. "I told you," Jack replied softly. "They want something from me. They think I've got something they can use. But it's not what you think. These guys, they're not just bikers. They're part of something bigger. A criminal network." Ricky swallowed hard, processing the information. "And you think they're doing all this just to get to you?" Jack nodded. "They don't stop until they get what they want. And if they're willing to hunt us down in the woods, they won't stop until they've got us in their hands." Ricky shuddered. "What if we can't outrun them? What if they catch us?" "We won't let that happen," Jack said, his voice firm. "We stay sharp. We don't stop until we know we're in the clear." The silence between them grew thick again, punctuated only by the distant calls of night birds. Jack turned to Ricky, meeting his eyes for the first time in a while. The fear was still there, but Jack saw a different look now, a flicker of understanding, of resolve. Ricky wasn't just some kid anymore. He was a survivor now. Jack's hand went to the small duffel bag slung across his shoulder. He grabbed a few essentials on their way out of the truck stop, but it wasn't much. He couldn't carry too much weight. He needed to stay fast, stay mobile. But he knew it wouldn't be long before they'd need food, water, and more supplies. "We need to find a place to rest," Jack said, breaking the silence. "A safe spot. I've got some food with me, but it won't last forever." Ricky nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. The constant motion, the fear, was starting to take its toll. "Where do we go now?" Ricky asked, looking around at the dense trees and thick underbrush. "How far can we really go? You said it yourself, we can't outrun them forever." Jack's jaw tightened. "We'll find a way. We always do." He took a deep breath, then glanced up at the sky. The night was clear, but the trees obscured the stars. Still, Jack had a rough sense of direction. He knew the area. They weren't far from an old hunting cabin that might offer them a temporary refuge. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. It would give them a chance to rest, gather their thoughts, and plan their next move. He motioned for Ricky to follow, and they began moving again, this time with more purpose. Jack led the way, weaving through the trees with practiced ease. He could feel the tension building in Ricky behind him, but the younger man didn't complain. He was getting used to the rhythm of survival. It wasn't long before they reached the edge of a clearing. There, partially hidden by dense underbrush, was the cabin. It was old, its wooden planks weathered by time, but it still stood. Jack felt a sense of relief wash over him. This place might offer them the short respite they needed. He motioned for Ricky to keep quiet as they approached. The last thing they needed was to make noise and draw attention. Jack's instincts told him that they were still being hunted. If the bikers were smart, they'd already be tracking their movements, searching the area for any signs of them. As they neared the cabin, Jack pushed open the creaky door, careful not to make too much noise. The inside was dim, the air musty, but it was dry. There was a small fireplace in the corner, and a few old chairs and tables scattered around. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. For now, it would have to do. Jack set down his bag and motioned for Ricky to sit. "We'll rest here for a while, get some food, drink, and plan our next move." Ricky nodded, but Jack could see the unease still written across his face. He knew the kid was scared. Hell, Jack was scared too. But there was something else now. The fear had become more focused. Ricky wasn't just running from danger. He was running to something. Jack couldn't help but wonder if that something was worth it. "Jack," Ricky said, his voice softer this time, "what happens if they find us here? What do we do then?" Jack didn't answer immediately. He didn't want to lie. The truth was, they couldn't stay hidden forever. Eventually, the bikers would catch up, and when they did, it wouldn't be pretty. But there was no sense in dwelling on that now. They had to keep moving, keep surviving, one step at a time. "We fight," Jack said finally, his voice quiet but filled with resolve. "We fight, and we make sure they know they messed with the wrong people." Ricky didn't say anything for a moment, just nodded slowly, processing the weight of Jack's words. Jack knew they were in for more than just a physical battle. This was a war now, a silent, deadly war, and they were in the middle of it. They couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until it was over. The cabin was their temporary haven, but it felt more like a trap. The walls were thin, the windows small and covered in dust. Time seemed to stretch here, each passing minute heavy with the knowledge that the bikers could be just around the corner. Jack couldn't afford to let his guard down, not even for a second. He paced back and forth, the worn floorboards creaking under his boots. Ricky was sitting by the fire, his hands wrapped around a canteen of water, his eyes fixed on the flames. The glow of the fire cast strange shadows across his face, making him look older than his years. "Jack, do you think we're safe here?" Ricky asked, his voice low. The question was simple, but it carried an undercurrent of fear, of uncertainty. Jack didn't respond right away. He didn't want to lie to the kid, but he also didn't want to add to his worry. The truth was, he didn't know. He had no idea if the bikers would find them here, or if they would even survive the next few days. But Jack wasn't about to show fear. Not in front of Ricky. "We're as safe as we can be for now," Jack said finally. He turned to look at Ricky, his expression hard. "But we can't stay here forever. We need to figure out our next move." Ricky nodded, his eyes still flickering between Jack and the fire. "Do you have a plan?" Jack let out a sharp breath and stopped pacing. He glanced around the cabin, taking in the sparse surroundings. There wasn't much here, no real weapons or supplies, just some old hunting gear and a few cans of beans. It wasn't enough. They needed more. "I've been thinking about it," Jack said slowly, his mind working through the possibilities. "There's a town about 10 miles from here. If we can get to it, we might be able to get some supplies, maybe even some backup. But the bikers are probably out there looking for us. We'll have to move fast." Ricky shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the decision settling in. "And if they catch us?" Jack didn't flinch. "We fight. We don't have much choice. But I'm not going down without a fight, and neither are you." Ricky met Jack's gaze, the fear still in his eyes. But there was something else too, something Jack hadn't seen in him before. A flicker of resolve. Ricky was starting to understand what it meant to survive. "All right," Ricky said, nodding slowly. "Let's do it. We can't just hide here." Jack gave him a tight smile. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Ricky was no longer just a kid trying to survive. He was becoming something more, a partner in this fight. Suddenly, there was a noise outside. A crack of a twig snapping, followed by the soft hum of engines in the distance. Jack froze, his heart racing. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. It was the bikers, coming closer. His instincts kicked in immediately. "Stay quiet," Jack whispered urgently to Ricky. "They're out there. We've got to move. Now." Ricky jumped to his feet, his face pale. "Do we fight them here?" "No," Jack said quickly. "We don't stand a chance here. We're getting out while we still can." He moved to the back of the cabin, where the door was slightly ajar. They had to move quickly. There was no time to waste. Jack pushed the door open just enough to slip through, motioning for Ricky to follow. They crept out into the woods, keeping low and quiet, trying to stay out of sight. The sound of the motorcycles grew louder. Jack could hear the engines revving, the growl of the bikes as they sped closer. The bikers weren't far off. Jack's heart raced as they moved through the trees, adrenaline pumping through his veins. They had no choice now but to run. The two of them moved swiftly through the woods, the darkness pressing in on them from all sides. Jack's mind raced as he calculated their best escape route. The town was their goal, but getting there would be dangerous. Every step could be the one that led them straight into the bikers' hands. They moved in silence, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of leaves underfoot. Jack could hear Ricky's breath coming in short, uneven bursts behind him. The kid was scared, and it was clear that every sound, every crack of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush, was sending him into a panic. But Jack didn't have time to comfort him. They couldn't afford to stop. The bikers were too close now. Suddenly, Jack heard the unmistakable sound of an engine revving, followed by the sound of tires skidding across the dirt. He spun around, his heart pounding. The bikers were getting closer. Too close. Get down, Jack hissed, grabbing Ricky by the arm and pulling him to the ground. They both hit the earth hard, their bodies slamming into the dirt. Jack's hand was on Ricky's mouth before the younger man could make a sound, his eyes wide with fear. Jack kept still, holding his breath as the sound of the motorcycle engines neared. The ground trembled beneath them as the bikers' bikes roared past, so close Jack could feel the vibrations in his bones. He didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. They had to wait, to stay hidden until the bikers were out of sight. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of the motorcycles began to fade. Jack cautiously lifted his head, peering through the underbrush. The bikers were gone, for now. He motioned for Ricky to get up, and they slowly rose to their feet. Both of them were covered in dirt, their clothes soaked with sweat. But Jack didn't pause. He didn't have time to rest. "We keep moving," Jack said, his voice low and urgent. "The town's not far, but we need to hurry." Ricky nodded, still breathing heavily. "What if they come back? What if they're still looking for us?" "They are," Jack said grimly. "But we can't worry about that now. We stay quiet. We stay fast. And we keep moving." With that, Jack led Ricky deeper into the forest, the night swallowing them whole. The forest felt endless. Every tree, every patch of undergrowth seemed identical to the last, blurring together into a disorienting sea of shadows. Jack and Ricky moved as quietly as they could, but Jack's mind never stopped racing. The bikers were out there. They knew they were being hunted, but they didn't know how close the danger really was. The sound of the motorcycles had faded hours ago, but Jack knew that the gang didn't give up easily. They were resourceful, relentless. Jack had crossed paths with enough dangerous people in his life to know that when someone like the biker gang set their sights on you, it was only a matter of time before they closed in. The thought made Jack's jaw tighten, but he didn't dare speak it aloud. Ricky's nerves were already raw, and Jack knew the last thing they needed was to add to the kid's fears. Jack glanced at Ricky, who was stumbling behind him, trying to keep up. The kid was panting heavily, his face pale from the exertion. He wasn't used to running like this, wasn't used to the fear that clung to every step. Jack didn't want to show it, but he could feel the fatigue creeping into his own bones, too. They had been on the move for hours, and there was no end in sight. "Stay with me," Jack called softly over his shoulder. "Don't let up." Ricky nodded, but Jack could see the anxiety etched on his face. The kid was trying, but it was clear that the weight of the situation was starting to take its toll. Jack didn't blame him. This was new territory for Ricky. He'd been thrown into a world of violence, danger, and survival, all in the span of a few days. But Jack couldn't afford to slow down, not now. Not when they were this close to the edge. "We're almost there," Jack said, more to reassure himself than Ricky. He had to believe that, or he would crack under the pressure. They had to get to the town. They had to make it there alive. The town wasn't far now, maybe another hour's trek through the woods. But Jack knew better than to relax, not when they were still in the heart of the danger zone. They couldn't afford any mistakes. Suddenly, Jack held up a hand, signaling for Ricky to stop. They were at the edge of a small clearing, and the sound of an engine had reached Jack's ears once again. This time, it was closer. He dropped to a crouch, motioning for Ricky to do the same. They both froze, hidden in the shadows of the trees, listening. The sound grew louder, unmistakable now. It was a motorcycle, revving and slowing down in a rhythm that suggested it was on the hunt. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as the bike's engine drew nearer. The biker was scouting the area, likely trying to pick up their trail. Jack's mind raced, weighing his options. He could feel the sweat trickling down the back of his neck. If they stayed hidden, the biker might just pass them by. But if they ran, if they gave away their position, they'd be caught. "Stay low," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. He could feel Ricky's tense body beside him, barely breathing. The motorcycle engine sputtered and then roared as it cut through the stillness of the night. Jack's body tensed, his eyes darting from the clearing to the edge of the forest. Every second felt like an eternity. The biker rounded the corner of the clearing, the motorcycle's headlights illuminating the ground in front of them. Jack's heart skipped a beat, but he remained perfectly still, praying they wouldn't be seen. The beam of light swept over them for a split second before the biker veered off again, speeding into the distance. Jack let out a slow breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He glanced at Ricky, who was still crouched beside him, his eyes wide in terror. Jack gave him a quick nod, and Ricky nodded back shakily. "Let's go," Jack muttered, keeping his voice low. They had to move quickly, but cautiously. The biker was still out there, and now they knew they were close. The only way to stay ahead of them was to push forward and hope they didn't make any more noise. The two of them slipped through the clearing, moving as quietly as possible. Every sound, every snap of a twig seemed deafening in the stillness of the night. Jack kept his eyes on the ground, searching for any sign that the bikers had spotted their tracks. "Jack, what do we do if we can't make it to the town?" Ricky's voice was a harsh whisper, laden with worry. Jack didn't answer right away. He was thinking fast, evaluating their options. If the bikers were on their trail, they'd have to get ahead of them somehow. Maybe they could make it to the town before the bikers caught up, but there was always the chance that they'd be blocked off, or worse, ambushed. "We're not giving up," Jack said finally, his voice hard. "We'll make it. We don't stop. If we can't get to the town, we find another way. We'll figure it out." Ricky seemed to absorb his words, nodding again, but there was still an underlying fear in his eyes. Jack could see it, could feel it in the way the kid moved, as if he was always waiting for the next shoe to drop. They moved deeper into the woods, their pace quickening as the sound of the motorcycle engines seemed to fade. Jack didn't dare look back, not yet. They needed to keep moving, keep getting closer to safety. But just as they pushed forward, another noise broke the stillness, this time, much closer than before. A second bike. Jack's eyes widened. The sound was unmistakable. The roar of an engine, not far away, getting louder. Ricky's hand shot out, grabbing Jack's arm with a tight grip. "They're right behind us." Jack's gaze flicked around the woods, searching for an escape route, but the trees were thick, the terrain uneven. They couldn't outrun these bikers. Not anymore. "There's a creek up ahead," Jack muttered, his mind racing. "If we can make it there, we'll have the cover of water. We might be able to hide." He tugged Ricky forward, pushing through the underbrush, heading in the direction of the creek. But with every step, the sound of the engines grew louder. They were closing in. The bikers were nearly on top of them. Jack's heart thudded in his chest as the trees thinned ahead of them. He could see the shimmering water in the distance, just past the last line of trees. They were almost there. And then, without warning, the sound of a motorcycle engine roared from behind them. The sound of the motorcycle behind them was unmistakable, close, too close. Jack didn't waste a second. He grabbed Ricky's arm and yanked him forward, pushing through the underbrush with everything he had. The creek was only a few hundred yards away, but it felt like miles, the thud of approaching tires sending adrenaline crashing through Jack's veins. Ricky's breath was coming in sharp, panicked gasps. "Jack, they're right behind us," he shouted, but Jack didn't slow down. The sound of the bike revving behind them was growing louder, closer, a low growl that reverberated through the trees. "Keep moving," Jack barked, his voice harsh with urgency. "We're almost there." The creek wasn't just a way to hide. It was their only shot at losing the bikers. Water could mask their tracks, and the thick brush around it would give them cover. But they had to reach it first. Suddenly, Jack heard the sharp hum of a bike engine cutting through the night air. The motorcycle was gaining on them. The roar of the engine vibrated in his bones, and Jack instinctively pulled Ricky behind a thick oak tree, hoping for a moment of concealment. But there was no time to rest. "Stay low," Jack hissed. He crouched down beside Ricky, holding his breath as the bike passed, just yards away from them. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, but the rider didn't seem to notice them. Jack and Ricky were frozen, barely daring to blink. The motorcycle passed, and Jack exhaled a slow breath. The rider didn't stop. They were moving, but not fast enough. Jack could still hear the engine behind them, still feel the pressure of time closing in. The bikers wouldn't give up. They couldn't. The sound of the bike faded into the distance, but it wasn't enough. They weren't safe. Not yet. Jack pulled Ricky back to his feet. We have to go now. The creek was close, just ahead, but the last stretch of open ground felt like a death sentence. They couldn't risk being seen. Jack scanned the area quickly and spotted a small patch of thick underbrush ahead, just before the creek. If they could make it there, they could hide for a moment, long enough to regroup. But it was a risk. Follow me, and don't make a sound, Jack instructed, his voice low but urgent. They sprinted as fast as they could, pushing their way through the thick trees and branches, the sound of the motorcycle engines growing louder once more. Jack's heart was pounding in his chest, the adrenaline making his every move feel more urgent, more desperate. As they reached the underbrush, Jack pulled Ricky down into the thick, wet ferns. He covered their bodies as best he could with leaves and branches, praying they wouldn't be spotted. Ricky's breath was coming in short, panicked bursts, his body trembling against Jack's. Jack had to force himself to stay calm. They couldn't afford to be found now, not when they were so close. They waited in silence, the only sound the rush of the creek just ahead and the distant hum of the motorcycles. Jack's mind raced. They had to be strategic. Ricky was too rattled, too new to this life of survival. He wasn't like Jack. Jack had learned to survive by doing whatever was necessary. He couldn't afford to get attached to anyone, hadn't allowed himself that luxury in years. But Ricky was different. Jack felt responsible for him, and that responsibility felt like a weight on his shoulders that was getting heavier with every passing second. They're getting closer, Ricky whispered, his voice tight with fear. Do you think they know where we are? Jack's jaw tightened. He didn't want to answer that. The truth was, he didn't know. All he knew was that he had to keep them moving, keep them alive. He needed to get to the creek. If they could cross it, they'd have a better chance of throwing off the bikers' pursuit. But it wasn't just the bikers they were up against. It was time, exhaustion, and a world that didn't care whether they lived or died. They'll pass, Jack muttered. They're just making sure we're not nearby. But they won't stay on this trail for long. Once they realize we're not here, they'll move on. Ricky's hands were shaking, but he didn't question Jack. He nodded, though his face was pale with fear. Minutes passed. It felt like hours, the tension thick in the air. The sound of the motorcycles grew louder, then faded as the bikers circled the area. Jack stayed perfectly still, his eyes scanning the edges of the forest for any sign of movement. Finally, the engine noise began to die down. Jack's heart began to slow, but he didn't dare move yet. Not until he was sure they were out of range. Just when he thought it was safe, there was a rustle in the bushes nearby. Jack's body tensed again. His instinct screamed for him to act. Then, he heard it, a voice. Think they went this way? A deep, gravelly voice asked. It was muffled, but Jack could tell it was one of the bikers. A second voice responded. Could be. They've got to be close. Let's split up. Jack felt his blood freeze. They were splitting up, and it was only a matter of time before they would be surrounded. We don't have much time, Jack muttered, his voice barely audible. He motioned for Ricky to follow him. But before they could move, a motorcycle engine roared to life once more. A light flashed through the trees, cutting through the darkness. It was too close. The light swept across the underbrush where they were hidden. Jack's breath caught in his throat. They were seconds away from being discovered. Run, Jack hissed. Go. With one last burst of adrenaline, Jack shoved Ricky forward, heading straight for the creek. They dashed through the underbrush, moving fast, but it felt like everything was closing in on them. They were almost there. Suddenly, the brush ahead of them parted, and Jack saw the glimmer of water. It was their last chance to lose the bikers. But just as they reached the creek, a voice shouted behind them. Gotcha! The sound of the voice shouting behind them was like a slap to Jack's senses. His heart thundered in his chest, and his legs pumped harder, pushing him through the underbrush. They had no choice. They had to make it to the creek. Jack could hear the roar of the motorcycle engines drawing closer, the bikers closing in, their pursuit relentless. He reached the water's edge, the fast-moving creek just in front of them. Without hesitation, Jack grabbed Ricky's arm and pulled him into the water. The cold of the creek hit them both like a shock, but Jack didn't give Ricky a moment to react. "Keep moving," Jack grunted, forcing Ricky into a crouch as they waded into the creek. The water was icy, the current stronger than Jack expected, but it was their only shot at losing the bikers. The water would obscure their trail, and the thick trees on either side would provide some cover. But the problem was that the water was also loud, rushing around their legs and pushing them forward. They'd have to keep their movements quiet, keep the noise to a minimum, or the bikers would hear them. "Stay low," Jack whispered. His voice strained as the water surged around his knees. Ricky followed his lead, moving cautiously through the water, trying to keep his balance in the slippery current. The sound of the motorcycles grew louder again. The bikers were right on their heels. Jack's mind raced. They had to get deeper into the creek, out of the reach of the light and the noise. If they stayed near the shore, they'd be easy targets. They had to make it further, where the water was deeper and the cover thicker. "Keep your head down, don't make a sound," Jack instructed as they pressed forward. The water surged around them, splashing and rushing. But they kept moving, pushing through the current, their legs aching from the strain. Every step felt like an eternity, but they kept going. The creek wound through the forest, its path curving around rocks and trees. Jack tried to stay calm, to ignore the fear gnawing at the back of his mind. But he could feel the bikers getting closer, the rumble of their engines almost drowning out the sound of the water. The trees grew denser on either side of them, and the current became stronger as they moved downstream. Jack glanced over at Ricky, who was stumbling slightly in the water, struggling to keep up. The kid's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Stay focused," Jack urged. "We're getting farther from them. Just keep moving." Ricky nodded, but Jack could tell he was struggling. The kid had been through a lot in such a short amount of time. Jack couldn't let him break now. They had to survive this. For both of them. The sounds of the motorcycles grew louder again. They were catching up. Jack looked over his shoulder, scanning the shoreline for any sign of movement. The bikers were getting closer, but the current had carried them far enough that the edge of the creek was out of sight. It wouldn't be long before they would lose their pursuers, but they had to keep going. Jack's eyes darted ahead. The creek bent sharply around a large cluster of rocks, and on the other side, he could see a small bank, hidden by the overhanging trees. It was their best chance. "Over there," Jack hissed, pointing to the small area of dry land. "That's where we're going." Without waiting for a response, Jack started swimming toward the opposite shore, pulling Ricky along with him. They both fought against the current, which was now surging with intensity, pushing them further downstream. The bank was only a few yards away, but Jack felt as if the current was dragging them backward. His muscles burned from the effort, and Ricky's struggle was visible, the kid barely keeping his head above water. "Come on," Jack grunted, fighting the water's pull. He reached the edge of the bank first, using his arms to drag himself onto the dry land. He turned and grabbed Ricky, pulling him the last few feet out of the creek. Once they were on the bank, Jack helped Ricky to his feet. They both collapsed onto the wet ground, gasping for breath. The creek water had numbed their limbs, but there was no time to rest. "Get up," Jack snapped, his voice hard as he yanked Ricky to his feet. "They'll be looking for us any minute." Ricky nodded quickly, his face white with fear but determined. He didn't argue. They had to keep moving. They scrambled up the muddy bank, the wetness of their clothes adding extra weight. The cold air bit at their skin as they began running through the forest once again, the sounds of the creek fading behind them. Jack's mind raced, and he couldn't stop looking over his shoulder. "We can't let them find us," Jack muttered under his breath, eyes scanning the trees. They kept moving, pressing through the thick brush. Every sound made Jack freeze. Every rustling leaf felt like an alarm. They couldn't afford any more mistakes. Minutes passed, and the sound of the motorcycles slowly started to fade, the bikers moving further away. Jack's eyes narrowed, straining to listen for any sign of pursuit. The distant rumble of engines was becoming harder to hear. They were out of sight, but not out of danger. Jack knew it wasn't over yet. They had to put as much distance between them and the bikers as possible. Jack and Ricky pushed forward, deeper into the woods, their legs heavy with exhaustion. They had no plan beyond survival. They had no idea where they were going, only that they had to stay ahead of the gang. The town still felt so far away, and now, with the bikers on their trail, getting to safety seemed like an impossible task. "Where do we go now?" Ricky gasped, looking around in confusion. The woods were dense, and Jack had no idea which way would lead them to safety. Jack didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure what came next. The one thing he did know was that they couldn't stop. "Not yet. We keep moving," Jack said, his voice low but resolute. "We find a place to hide, and we wait for our chance." The night stretched on, the cold and the darkness closing in around them. The only thing that mattered was survival. And for now, survival meant keeping their heads down and waiting for the right moment to strike. The forest seemed to swallow them whole, the shadows stretching long in the moonlight. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves made Jack's heart race, but he pushed on, dragging Ricky along with him. The cold from the creek still seeped into his bones, but there was no time to stop and warm up. They needed to keep moving, to stay out of sight. Jack's mind raced, calculating their next steps. The bikers were still out there. Even though they'd managed to slip away for now, it wouldn't be long before they caught up. They had no food, no gear, and no solid plan. They were on the run, and survival was all that mattered. They came to a clearing, and Jack paused, scanning the area. The soft light of the moon filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows. There was a small hill ahead, its top dotted with thick brush, but it was the best cover they had right now. It would give them a vantage point, a place to catch their breath and regroup. "Over there," Jack said, pointing toward the hill. "Let's get to the top." Ricky didn't question it, moving quickly in spite of his fatigue. They made their way up the slope, carefully avoiding any fallen branches that might give away their position. Jack's muscles screamed for rest, but he ignored them, his eyes constantly scanning for any signs of movement. They reached the top of the hill and huddled behind a large boulder, the wind biting at their skin. Jack crouched low, still listening for any sign of the bikers, his eyes searching the darkened forest below. The forest stretched out for miles, but it felt like they were completely alone in this vast, silent world. Jack took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. They had bought themselves a little time, but that wouldn't last long. They had to figure out their next move. Ricky, still breathing heavily, glanced over at Jack. "What now?" Ricky asked, his voice hoarse from the cold. Jack sighed. He wasn't sure how to answer. They needed shelter, food, something to keep them alive, but they couldn't afford to risk going back to the road where the bikers would surely be searching. They had to stay in the woods, blend in with the wilderness, and wait for the right opportunity. "We wait," Jack said quietly. "We've got to stay off the grid, stay out of sight. If we keep moving through the woods, the bikers won't find us. But we can't stop yet." "They're not that far behind." Ricky nodded, his eyes wide with fear, but he understood. There was no other choice. They had to stay hidden. Jack leaned back against the boulder, trying to steady his breathing. His body ached, and he could feel the exhaustion setting in, but he couldn't let himself slow down. Not yet. There was still too much at stake. Ricky sat down beside him, pulling his jacket tighter around himself for warmth. The cold was starting to get to him, too. Jack glanced at the kid and couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. Ricky hadn't asked for any of this. He was just trying to survive, and Jack had dragged him into this mess. "Hey, you doing okay?" Jack asked, his voice softer than before. Ricky nodded but didn't speak. Jack could see the strain in his eyes. The kid was barely hanging on, and Jack knew it. He had to keep him going. "We'll get through this," Jack said, his voice firm. "Just keep your head down. We'll find a way out." Ricky gave him a weak smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Jack didn't know if he believed it himself, but he had to. He had to keep the kid hopeful, even if the situation seemed hopeless. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the wind rustling the leaves around them. Jack could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, the darkness closing in. He wasn't sure how much longer they could keep this up. The bikers weren't stupid. They would eventually figure out where Jack and Ricky were hiding. Jack's mind wandered to the past, to the time before this chase began. Before all the violence and the danger. He had never wanted this life for himself. He had fought in wars, dealt with things that most people couldn't even imagine. But this was different. This wasn't a war. This wasn't about survival on the battlefield. It was about trying to stay alive when the world felt like it was closing in around you. Suddenly, Ricky's voice broke the silence. "Jack." Jack turned to look at him. Ricky's eyes were wide with fear, and Jack could see the sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. "What is it?" Jack asked, his voice low. I thought I saw something," Ricky said, his voice shaking. "I thought I saw lights." Jack's heart skipped a beat. The sound of a motorcycle engine was distant, but it was growing louder. He strained to listen, his pulse quickening. The bikers were getting closer. "Get down," Jack ordered urgently, pulling Ricky lower behind the boulder. He couldn't afford to be seen. Not now. The last thing they needed was to be cornered in the open. They both crouched low, the sound of the motorcycle engine now unmistakable. Jack's grip tightened on Ricky's arm, his eyes scanning the trees below. The light from the motorcycle headlights swept across the landscape, casting long shadows on the ground. Jack held his breath. The light moved closer, and Jack's heart pounded in his chest. They were almost there. The bikers had to be right below them. Jack's mind raced. If they stayed still, they might be able to wait the bikers out. But if the gang got too close, they'd be caught. It was a gamble, but right now, it was all they had. The motorcycle engine revved again, closer now. Jack clenched his jaw, holding Ricky's arm tightly, trying to steady his own breathing. They couldn't afford to make a sound. For a long, agonizing moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, the sound of the motorcycle engines began to fade. The headlights drifted off into the distance. Jack exhaled a slow breath, relief flooding his body. But he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The sound of the motorcycles faded into the distance, but Jack didn't dare relax. He remained low, his body tense, his breath shallow as he watched the lights flicker and disappear into the night. The bikers hadn't passed yet. They could be circling back, waiting for the right moment to strike. Ricky, breathing softly beside him, shifted nervously. Jack could feel the kid's fear radiating off him, but Ricky had learned not to make a sound. Jack had taught him that much. Silence was their ally now. For what seemed like hours, they lay hidden behind the boulder, neither of them moving, not even daring to look over the edge. The wind whispered through the trees, a stark contrast to the pounding of Jack's heart. His mind raced. The bikers were clever. They'd find them sooner or later, and Jack wasn't sure how much longer he could keep them both hidden. They were exhausted. They hadn't eaten in days, and the cold from the creek had settled deep into their bones. "Jack," Ricky whispered finally, breaking the silence. "Do you think they're gone?" Jack strained to hear. The distant sound of engines had disappeared, but the forest was still. Too still. The darkness stretched on endlessly, making every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves feel like an alarm bell. "I don't know," Jack muttered, his voice low but resolute. "But we can't stay here. We've got to keep moving." Ricky nodded, his face pale in the moonlight. They had to leave the hill. The longer they stayed, the more likely it was that the bikers would come back. Jack needed to get Ricky out of there. But to where? He glanced at the thick woods surrounding them. There were no roads nearby, no signs of civilization. They were alone. With a grunt, Jack pushed himself to his feet, using the boulder as leverage. He reached down to help Ricky up, his fingers trembling with exhaustion. The kid was thinner than he had been before, his body weak from hunger and stress, but he managed to stand with Jack's help. "We go west," Jack said, his voice steady. "There's a river over that way. If we can get to it, we might find a way out." Ricky didn't argue. He simply nodded, eyes wide and scanning the dark horizon. They moved swiftly, keeping to the shadows, using the trees and underbrush for cover as they navigated through the dense woods. Jack's mind raced, constantly assessing their surroundings. Every crunch of a leaf underfoot, every whisper of the wind made him tense, but they couldn't afford to stop. The minutes stretched into hours as they walked. Jack's legs were sore, and the cold seemed to seep into every fiber of his being, but he kept pushing forward. He couldn't stop. Not now. They needed to get to that river, to find shelter, and Most importantly, to survive. Finally, as the moon reached its peak in the sky, they stumbled upon a clearing. Jack stopped, his body rigid with alertness. The trees gave way to a view of the river, its water shimmering under the moonlight. "Here," Jack said, motioning to the riverbank. "We'll follow the river. We'll stick to the water. The bikers won't follow us in there." Ricky nodded but didn't speak. He seemed too drained to say anything more, his face pale, his body trembling from exhaustion. Jack could feel the same weight pressing down on him, the feeling of dread settling deep into his chest. They weren't safe yet. They moved cautiously toward the river, Jack's eyes darting from side to side, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. They had made it this far, but the danger wasn't over. They were still being hunted. As they reached the water's edge, Jack paused, kneeling to take a drink. The water was cold but refreshing, a brief reprieve from the long night. He gestured for Ricky to do the same, and the kid crouched down beside him, drinking eagerly from the river. They both heard it at the same time. The sound of motorcycles. Not distant anymore. Closer. Jack's heart sank. They had found them. The headlights of the bikers cut through the trees like a spotlight, sweeping across the landscape. Jack's blood ran cold as he looked at Ricky. The kid's face was frozen in fear. "Run," Jack ordered, his voice a low growl. He didn't wait to see if Ricky would follow. He dashed into the trees, pushing through the thick underbrush, his heart pounding in his chest. Ricky was right behind him, his footsteps a frantic echo of Jack's, but Jack knew they couldn't outrun them forever. The bikers had the advantage of speed and numbers. The sound of the motorcycles grew louder, closer. Jack's mind raced, formulating a plan as they moved. They reached a dense thicket, the trees crowding around them. Jack's eyes flicked to the side. There, in the distance, a rock outcropping loomed ahead. It was their only chance. "Over there," Jack shouted, pointing to the rocks. "We'll climb up. Get to higher ground." Without hesitation, Jack made for the outcropping, his muscles screaming with the effort. Ricky was close behind, panting heavily, but they both knew they had to make it. The rocks were jagged, rough, and offered no easy foothold, but they had no choice. They scrambled up the rocks, their feet slipping in the wet dirt as the sound of the motorcycles grew closer. Jack reached the top first, gripping the edge of the rocks with bloodied hands. He looked down at Ricky, who was just a few feet below. The kid's face was filled with panic, but Jack reached down and pulled him up, hauling him to safety. They crouched low, watching the bikers approach the base of the rocks. Jack's breath was ragged, but he kept his eyes on the road below. The bikers' engines roared, echoing through the forest, but they didn't see Jack or Ricky. The trees and the rocks provided just enough cover. Minutes passed. The bikers searched the area below, their voices cutting through the night air. Jack's pulse raced, and his grip on the rock tightened. He couldn't breathe. Every moment felt like an eternity. Then, the engines began to fade. The bikers were moving on. They were leaving. Jack let out a long, slow breath. They had survived. For now. But Jack knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He'd be damned if he let them get away with what they had done. He had promised Ricky they would make it out alive, and Jack wasn't the kind of man who broke his promises. He turned to Ricky, who was looking at him, exhausted but relieved. "We'll get them," Jack said, his voice low but firm. "We'll get them, kid. And when we do, it'll be over." Ricky nodded slowly, his face grim but resolute. Jack stood up, his hand resting on the rough stone. It wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like they had a shot. They would survive. They would fight. And when the time came, they would make sure the bikers knew they'd messed with the wrong people.